Tonight, a king lives. Not because the king deserves to live. Robert Baratheon has spent 17 years on the Iron Throne, earning every death the gods could design for him. Through wine and women, and the slow ruination of a body that was once the finest weapon in the Seven Kingdoms. Tonight, a king lives because a boar's tusk missed an artery by 2 inches. Because the maesters worked faster than the blood flowed. Because Robert Baratheon's body refused to quit with the same stupid, furious stubbornness that Robert had brought to every fight he'd ever fought, including the ones against himself. A king lives, and the living changes everything. The Queen's plans, the Hand's fate, the names of 3 golden-haired children, and a war that was coming whether the king drew breath or not. Because the question was never whether Robert Baratheon would survive the Boar. The question was whether the 7 Kingdoms would survive Robert Baratheon. The Boar. What should have killed him? The Boar came out of the tree line like a black boulder rolling downhill. Robert saw it. Robert saw it through the haze of wine. The wine that Lancel Lannister had been pouring all morning. The wine that was stronger than Robert's usual, and that Robert had been drinking. Because drinking was what Robert did on hunts, and the hunting was an excuse. And beyond the excuse sat the bottle, and the bottle was the only honest companion Robert had left. The Boar was enormous, 200 pounds of muscle and tusk, and the killing instinct that the forest bred into its animals the way the Red Keep bred cruelty into its kings. The Boar charged, and Robert raised the spear, and the spear should have found the mark, should have punched through the thick hide and into the heart, and ended the hunt with the clean efficiency that Robert's body remembered from 20 years ago, even if Robert's body could no longer produce it. The spear missed. Not missed, glanced. The point hit the Boar's shoulder instead of its chest, sliding off the bone, opening a wound that was bloody but not fatal, and the Boar kept coming. The Boar hit Robert in the gut. The tusk, curved, yellow, filthy with forest mud. The tusk punched into Robert's belly, and Robert felt the pain arrive with the sound of his own voice screaming, and Robert screamed the scream of a king discovering that he was meat. That the Boar did not care about crowns or kingdoms or the Baratheon name. The Boar cared about the tusk, and the tusk was in Robert's belly, and Robert was falling. Barristan Selmy moved. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the Old Knight, the legendary knight, Barristan the Bold, who had killed Maelys the Monstrous on the Stepstones, and who had stormed the walls of Duskendale, and who was now, at 63, still faster than any man in the Kingswood. Barristan's sword found the Boar's neck. The stroke was clean, the clean stroke of a man who had been killing since before Robert was born, and whose killing was the craft, and the craft was perfection. The Boar's head came half off. The Boar collapsed. The Boar died on top of the king it had just gutted. The animal's blood mixing with the king's blood on the forest floor. Your Grace. Barristan pulled the Boar off Robert. The pulling required strength that Barristan should not have had, 63 years old. In full armor, pulling 200 pounds of dead animal off a wounded king. But Barristan had the strength because Barristan needed the strength, and needing was having when the alternative was a dead king in the dirt. Robert lay on the forest floor. The wound was visible. The tusk had opened a gash in Robert's belly, long and ugly and bleeding with the steady persistence of a wound that intended to kill. The blood was dark. The blood was the wrong color. Too dark. The color that meant organs. The color that meant the wound was not surface damage, but the deep kind that maesters feared and soldiers recognized as the dying color. Get the maesters, Barristan said. To the hunting party, the lords and knights and squires who had been standing in the trees watching their king fight a boar, and who were now standing in the trees watching their king bleed. Get the maesters. Now. Lancel Lannister ran. The boy ran with urgency. The urgency of a squire who had been told to give the king strong wine, and who was now watching the king die, and whose watching was the guilt, and the guilt was the running, and the running was the speed that guilt produced. Robert was conscious. Robert was conscious because Robert Baratheon did not lose consciousness from pain. Not at Storm's End. Not at the Trident. Not in 17 years of hangovers that would have killed lesser men. Robert was conscious, and Robert was looking at the sky through the Kingswood canopy, and Robert was thinking the thought that wounded men think. This is stupid. This is a stupid way to die. Killed by a pig in a forest. The man who killed Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident, killed by a pig. How bad, Robert said. Not a question. A demand. The demand of a man who wanted the truth, and who had always wanted the truth, even when the truth was the wound, and the wound was fatal. Barristan looked at the wound. Barristan had seen wounds. Barristan had seen every kind of wound that steel and wood and animal could produce, and Barristan had catalogued the wounds by category. The kind you survived, the kind you didn't, and the kind that depended on the maesters and the gods and the stubbornness of the man bleeding. Bad, Your Grace. Bad means dead, or bad means the maesters decide, not me. Robert laughed. The laugh was the wrong sound, the wet, gurgling sound of a man laughing with a hole in his belly, the sound that pushed blood out of the wound with each spasm of the chest. The maesters, the bald men with the chains. They're going to decide whether the king lives or dies. They'll do their work, Your Grace. Their work. Their work. Ned should be here. Ned would. Robert stopped. The pain arrived and stole his words. The real pain. The pain that followed the shock. The deep, grinding, organ-level pain that said, the tusk went further than you think. The tusk went into places that tusks are not supposed to go. Don't talk, Your Grace. Don't tell me, Robert coughed. Blood on his lips. Red on the black beard. Don't tell me what to do, Selmy. I'm the king. I'll talk if Robert did not finish the sentence. Not because Robert lost consciousness, because the pain stole the words. The pain took the sentence out of Robert's mouth and replaced it with the sound that pain made, which was silence and the grinding of teeth and the refusal to scream, because kings did not scream. Robert Baratheon had screamed once, at the Trident, when the Warhammer found Rhaegar's chest and the rubies scattered, and the screaming was triumph. That was the only scream Robert had ever allowed. This scream, the pain scream, the Boar scream, Robert swallowed it. The swallowing cost more than the wound. The maesters arrived. 2 of them. The Kingswood was close enough to King's Landing that the ravens had reached the Red Keep, and the maesters had ridden out with the speed that a dying king demanded. The maesters examined the wound. The maesters exchanged the look that maesters exchanged when the wound was the kind that killed, and the patient would die, and the dying was not something you said in front of the patient. Out with it, Robert said. Eyes closed, teeth clenched. The blood still coming, slower now, the body doing what bodies did, trying to clot, trying to save itself from the stupidity of the mind that had driven it into a forest with too much wine, and not enough sense. The tusk penetrated the abdominal wall. Your Grace. The bow may be, am I going to die? We must get you to the Red Keep. We must clean the wound, and am I going to die? The maesters exchanged the look again. The look said, probably. The look said, the wound is deep, and the bowel is likely perforated, and the infection will set in within 2 days, and the infection will kill him within 4. The look said, start writing the succession documents. The wound is serious, Your Grace, but survivable. If we act now. The if was the word. The if was the maester's escape, the conditional that protected the maester from the accusation of failure, because the condition was the caveat, and the caveat was the shield. If we act now. If the wound doesn't fester. If the king's body is strong enough. If, then act, Robert said. Stop talking and act. They carried Robert back to King's Landing. They carried him on a litter, the king of the 7 kingdoms on a wooden frame, bleeding through the bandages, the blood leaving a trail on the King's Road, like a wounded animal marking its path. The hunting party rode alongside. Barristan rode at the king's side. The gold cloaks cleared the road. The city saw the litter, and the city produced the sound that cities produced when kings were dying. The murmur, the growing wave of voices and rumors that spread from gate to street to alley to tavern with the speed that bad news traveled, which was faster than ravens. The king was carried into the Red Keep. The king was carried to his chambers. The maesters went to work. the cutting and cleaning and sewing that the Citadel trained, and that the Citadel practiced on corpses, and that the Maesters were now practicing on a man who was not yet a corpse, but who smelled like one. The wound was cleaned. The bowel was nicked, not perforated. The nick was the difference. The nick was survivable where the perforation was fatal, and the difference between the nick and the perforation was the 2 inches that the tusk had missed. 2 inches to the left, and the bowel was torn open, and Robert Baratheon died within the week. 2 inches to the right, and the tusk missed the bowel entirely, and Robert Baratheon walked away with a scar and a story. 2 inches. The margin between one world and another. The Maesters sewed. The Maesters packed the wound with boiled linen and herb poultices, and the medicines that the Citadel kept for wounds that might kill, and that might not. The Maesters announced, the king lived. The king would recover. The king would need weeks of rest, and the rest was the prescription. And the prescription was no wine, no women, no movement. Robert Baratheon would follow none of these prescriptions. Robert Baratheon would do exactly what Robert Baratheon always did, which was whatever Robert Baratheon wanted. But the Maesters prescribed them anyway, because prescribing was the job, and the job was the protocol, and the protocol existed independent of whether the patient followed it. The king slept. The milk of the poppy, the sweet, dreamless sleep that the Maesters gave to men who were in too much pain to heal without it. Robert drank the poppy milk, and Robert slept, and Robert's sleep began the absence that would last 9 days, and that would, during those 9 days, unmake everything that Ned Stark had been trying to hold together. 9 days. The king slept for 9 days, and in 9 days, Cersei Lannister built a new world. The Queen. What 9 days built? Cersei moved on the first day. Not the first hour. The first hour belonged to the panic, the palace chaos of servants and maesters and counselors rushing to the king's chambers and producing the noise that dying kings generated. The first hour was the performance. Cersei at Robert's bedside, the concerned wife, the queen holding her husband's hand while the maesters worked. The performance was convincing because Cersei was an excellent performer, and because the performance served the purpose, and the purpose was time. By the second hour, Cersei was in the small council chamber. The king is incapacitated, Cersei said. Seated, not at Robert's seat, at the head of the table, the seat that was the power seat, the seat that said, I am here, and the king is not, and the not being here is the opening. The king may not recover. The succession must be managed. The king's hand manages the realm in the king's absence, Pycelle said. Grand Maester Pycelle, the old man, the Lannister loyalist, the creature whose chains marked him as a scholar, and whose loyalties marked him as something less. Lord Stark is not here. Ned was not there. Ned was not there because Ned was in the Tower of the Hand, doing what Ned did, working, planning, trying to manage the crisis through the application of honor to a situation that required something other than honor. Ned had not been summoned to the small council meeting. The not summoning was Cersei's first move. The not summoning was the exclusion, and the exclusion was the weapon, and the weapon was, if the hand is not at the table belongs to someone else. Littlefinger was at the table. Varys was at the table. Renly was not. Renly had left the city 2 days before the hunt, riding to Highgarden on business that Renly described as personal, and that everyone understood was Margaery Tyrell. Renly's absence was not Cersei's doing. Renly's absence was luck, and luck was the thing that Cersei received in the same proportion that Cersei received everything, generously, and without deserving it. The king named Lord Stark as hand. Varys said. Varys, the spider, the eunuch, the man whose information network was the finest in Westeros, and whose loyalties were the finest mystery in Westeros. The hand governs in the kings. The hand governs when the king permits. The king is unconscious. The king cannot permit or deny. The queen, Cersei paused. The pause was the construction. The pause was Cersei building the legal argument that Cersei needed to do what Cersei intended to do. The queen is the king's wife. The queen is the mother of the heir. The Queen, in the absence of the king's capacity, speaks with the king's voice. That's not. Pycelle began. Isn't it? The king's mother ruled as regent for Aegon III. The Queen Mother ruled for. Those were regencies for child kings. King Robert is not dead, Your Grace. King Robert is. King Robert is lying in a bed with a hole in his stomach, and his eyes have not opened in 20 hours. King Robert may die tonight. He may die tomorrow. He may live. But until Robert opens his eyes and gives an order, someone must give orders. And that someone is not going to be Ned Stark. The sentence landed. The sentence landed because the sentence was the truth that Cersei had been carrying. The truth that had nothing to do with regencies or precedents or the legal architecture of the Iron Throne. The truth was, Ned Stark knows. Ned Stark knows about the children. Ned Stark knows about Jaime. And if Ned Stark governs while Robert sleeps, Ned Stark will act on what he knows, and the acting will destroy Cersei and the children and House Lannister and everything that Cersei has spent 20 years building. Littlefinger watched. Littlefinger, Lord Petier Baelish, Master of Coin, the man whose smile was the mask, and the mask was the weapon, and the weapon was patience. Littlefinger watched, and Littlefinger calculated, and Littlefinger's calculation was, which side wins? Not which side is right. Littlefinger did not traffic in right. Littlefinger trafficked in winning. The Queen has a point, Littlefinger said. Smooth, reasonable, the voice that sold dangerous ideas as common sense. The king is incapacitated. The hand may act, but the hand acts on the king's authority, and the king's authority requires the king's consciousness. Until Robert wakes, perhaps a shared governance, there is no shared governance. I am the Queen. Joffrey is the heir. The governance is mine. Ned arrived at the council chamber 20 minutes after the meeting began. 20 minutes of exclusion. 20 minutes in which Cersei had established the frame, and the frame was, the Queen governs. Not the hand. The Queen. Ned entered. Ned saw the seating. Ned saw Cersei at the head. Ned saw the faces, Pycelle's discomfort, Varys's blank mask, Littlefinger's thin smile. Ned read the room the way Ned read everything, honestly, directly, with the blunt assessment of a man who trusted his own judgment and whose judgment said, this is wrong. This is a seizure. This is Cersei taking what Cersei should not take. The king named me Hand, Ned said. Standing, not sitting, because sitting meant accepting the arrangement, and the arrangement was Cersei's, and the accepting would be Ned's surrender. The hand governs in the king's absence. The king is not absent. The king is dying. The king is recovering. The maesters. The maesters say what maesters say. The maesters hedge. The maesters use words like may and possible and hopeful because the maesters are cowards who won't say what they mean, which is, Robert is probably going to die. And when Robert dies, Joffrey is king. And when Joffrey is king, the Queen Regent governs until Joffrey comes of age. Robert is not dead. Robert is not conscious. Consciousness and death, the distance between them is shorter than you think, Lord Stark. Ned looked at Cersei. Ned looked at Cersei, and Ned knew. Ned knew. Because Ned had been investigating for weeks, investigating Jon Arryn's death, investigating the children, investigating the truth that Robert's heirs were not Robert's heirs, and that the golden hair was Lannister hair, and that the truth was the weapon. And the weapon was pointed at the woman sitting at the head of the table. Ned knew, and Cersei knew, that Ned knew, and between them stood a war, the silent, invisible war between a man who had the truth and a woman who had the power, and whose power was the defense against the truth. I told you to leave, Ned said, not loudly. The Stark voice, the Northern voice, the voice that did not need volume because the words carried their own weight. I told you to take the children and leave King's Landing. And I told you, you told me nothing. I gave you a warning. I gave you mercy. I told you what would happen when Robert learned the truth. And instead of running, Ned gestured at the table, at the arrangement, at the seizure. Instead of running, I'm governing. Because governing is what queens do when kings are bleeding to death in their beds. Running is what Cersei stopped, choosing her words, choosing the weapon. Running is what the Stark should have done. Running is what Lyanna should have done. The name. Lyanna, the name that was the blade that Cersei kept sharpened for moments when Cersei needed to hurt, and when the hurting needed to be precise. Cersei said Lyanna, and the name hit Ned, in the place where the name always hit. In the memory, in the loss. In the wound that 17 years had not healed, because some wounds were designed never to heal. Don't what? Don't mention the dead girl that my husband spent 20 years mourning instead of ruling? Don't mention the ghost that I've been competing with since the day Robert put a crown on my head and called me by her name on our wedding night? Don't mention Lyanna? This isn't about... Everything is about Lyanna. Robert's drinking is about Lyanna. Robert's whoring is about Lyanna. Robert's hatred of me is about Lyanna. You want to tell Robert the truth about my children? Tell him this truth first. I gave him 3 children, and he gave me nothing. Not a kind word, not a sober evening, not a single moment where he looked at me and saw me instead of her. So I found someone who did. I found someone who... Your brother. The word detonated. The word was the truth that Cersei had been dancing around and that Ned had just thrown on the table like a severed head. Your brother. Jaime, the Kingslayer. The Golden Twin, the truth that Jon Arryn had died for, and that Ned had nearly died for, and that was now sitting in the small council chamber like a fire waiting to spread. Littlefinger's expression did not change. Varys's expression did not change. Pycelle's expression changed, the old man's face producing the shock that the old man's politics could not suppress. The shock of a Lannister loyalist hearing the accusation that would destroy the house he served. "Leave us," Cersei said. "To the council, all of you. Leave." They left. They left because the Queen commanded, and because the accusation was the kind of accusation that men did not want to hear, because hearing meant knowing, and knowing meant danger. Littlefinger left with the smile. Varys left with the blankness. Pycelle left with the shuffling retreat of a man who had just heard the death sentence of everything he'd spent his career protecting. Ned and Cersei. "Alone, you won't tell him," Cersei said. "I already told him, before the hunt. I told Robert what Jon Arryn discovered." Cersei's face changed. The change was small, the contraction around the eyes, the tightening of the jaw, the physical response to the information that Cersei had not expected, and that changed every calculation. Robert knew. Robert already knew. Robert went hunting knowing the truth about the children, and the hunting had been Robert's method of processing through physical violence and alcohol. Through killing an animal in the woods, while the information killed a part of him that would never grow back. Then, Robert chose. Cersei said. Robert didn't choose. Robert ran. Robert does what Robert always does. He went into the forest, and he drank, and he killed something, and he told himself he'd deal with it later, and later is now, and later is Robert lying in a bed with a hole in his gut, and you sitting in his chair. Later is never, Lord Stark. Later is the word that weak men use to postpone the decisions that strong men would make. Robert has been saying later for 17 years. Later I'll be a better king. Later I'll stop drinking. Later I'll deal with my wife. Later, later, later. Robert says later because Robert doesn't want to decide. And the not deciding is the deciding. The deciding to let everything rot. Robert will wake up. Maybe. Robert will wake up and Robert will deal with this. Robert will wake up and Robert will drink himself back to sleep, because dealing is the one thing that Robert Baratheon has never done. And when Robert is drunk and sleeping, I will still be here. I will still be governing. I will still be protecting my children from the truth that you want to use as a weapon. The truth is not a weapon. The truth is always a weapon. The truth is the most dangerous weapon in the world, because the truth cannot be argued with, and the truth cannot be bought, and the truth, in the wrong hands, Lord Stark, in your hands, the truth is the death of 3 children who have done nothing wrong except exist. The argument ended, because arguments between Ned Stark and Cersei Lannister always ended in the same place, in the wall. The impenetrable wall between honor and survival, between the man who would not lie and the woman who would not surrender. The wall was the impasse, and the impasse was the future, and the future was 9 days of Robert sleeping while Cersei built, and Ned planned, and the building and the planning were the two weapons pointed at each other across the body of a king who would not wake up. 9 days. On the 3rd day, Cersei arrested Ned Stark. The arrest happened at night. The arrest happened because Cersei understood timing, understood that the night was the cover, and the cover was the advantage, and the advantage was sleeping men, were slow men. Cersei sent the gold cloaks. Janos Slynt, the commander of the city watch, the man whose loyalty had been purchased with the promise of Harrenhal, and whose purchased loyalty was the strongest kind, because purchased men feared the loss of the purchase more than they feared the gods. Slynt brought 50 gold cloaks to the Tower of the Hand, 50 men against Ned's household guard of 20 Northerners, 20 men who were brave, and who were loyal, and who were outnumbered, and who died in the corridors of the Tower of the Hand in the small hours of the morning, because dying for their lord was the Northern way, and the Northern way was the only way that Northerners knew. Ned fought. Ned fought because Ned was a soldier before Ned was a lord, and a lord before Ned was a hand, and the fighting was the instinct that the title could not suppress. Ned fought with the greatsword that was not ice. Ice was in the armory, too large for the corridors. Ned fought with a longsword, and the fighting lasted until the numbers told. 50 gold cloaks against 1 man. The 50 won. The 50 always won. They dragged Ned to the black cells. The black cells, the dungeons beneath the Red Keep, the cells where the light never reached, and where the prisoners sat in darkness, and where the darkness was the punishment. Because the darkness was the absence of the world, and the absence of the world was the death before death. Ned sat in the darkness and thought about what he had done wrong. The list was long. The list was the list of a man who had played the Game of Thrones with honor, and who had discovered that honor in King's Landing was the losing hand. He had warned Cersei. He had given her the chance to flee. He had told her what he knew and expected her to respond with fear, and the fear to produce flight. Instead, Cersei had responded with power. Cersei had responded the way Cersei always responded, by attacking, by seizing, by refusing to be the prey when Cersei could be the predator. Ned's household was destroyed. His men were dead or captured. His daughters, Sansa, was in her chambers, confined, guarded by Lannister men. Arya was. Ned did not know where Arya was. Arya was missing. Arya had vanished. And the vanishing was either the death or the escape, and Ned did not know which. And the not knowing was the torture that the black cells added to the darkness. Cersei announced, the Hand of the King was arrested for treason. The Hand had plotted against the crown. The Hand had plotted to seize power while the king recovered. The charges were fabricated with the precision that Cersei brought to fabrication. The precision of a woman who understood that lies worked best when they contained enough truth to be plausible. Ned had been planning to move against Cersei. Ned had been preparing to challenge the succession. The truth of Ned's intentions was the foundation of Cersei's lies. And the foundation was solid enough that the lies stood. Littlefinger confirmed the charges. Littlefinger, the man who had promised Ned the gold cloak's loyalty, the man who had looked Ned in the eye and said, "I told you not to trust me," and whose telling was the only honest thing Littlefinger had ever said. Littlefinger confirmed the charges because Littlefinger's calculations said, Cersei wins. Cersei wins because Robert is dying, and the Queen controls the court, and the controlling is the winning, and Littlefinger always stood with the winner. Days passed. The days were the days of Cersei's consolidation. The consolidation that Cersei performed with the efficiency of a woman who had been planning for this moment since the first night Robert came to her bed, smelling of another woman's perfume. Cersei consolidated. Cersei placed Lannister men in every position of authority. Cersei replaced the Baratheon guards with Lannister guards. Cersei turned the Red Keep into a Lannister fortress while the king bled and slept and did not know. On the 7th day, Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, not as king, as regent. Cersei was careful with the distinction. Robert was alive. Robert was recovering. Joffrey was not king. Joffrey was the Prince Regent, governing in his father's incapacity, exercising the crown's authority until the crown could exercise its own. The legal fiction was thin, thin enough that anyone who looked could see through it, thin enough that the lords and ladies of the court could see the boy on the throne, and know that the boy was not a regent, but a usurper, and the usurping was happening in plain sight, and nobody stopped it. Because stopping required power, and power was what Cersei had taken. On the 9th day, Joffrey ordered Ned Stark brought before the court. Joffrey ordered this because Joffrey was 13 and cruel, and because cruelty in a 13-year-old was not the calculated cruelty of a Tywin, or the survival cruelty of a Cersei, but the purposeless cruelty of a child who had been given a throne, and who used the throne the way children used wings on insects, for the screaming, for the power of making someone scream. The traitor confesses, Joffrey said, from the Iron Throne. The boy on the throne, the golden-haired boy whose golden hair was the evidence, and whose evidence was the accusation, and whose accusation was sitting in a dungeon beneath the boy's feet. The traitor confesses, or the traitor dies. Cersei stood beside the throne. Cersei's face was the mask, the Queen's mask, the public mask, the mask that showed concern and authority and the appropriate gravity of a queen managing a crisis. Behind the mask, panic. Behind the mask, the calculation that said, this boy is going too far. This boy is making decisions that the boy should not be making. This boy is going to kill Ned Stark, and the killing will bring the North down on King's Landing. And the bringing down is the destruction. Your Grace, Cersei said, to Joffrey. The title was the leash that Cersei used to pull Joffrey back from the edges of his cruelty. Perhaps the traitor should be given the opportunity to confess and take the black. A merciful outcome. I don't want merciful. I want his head. A confession serves us better than a head. A confession says, the traitor admits his crime. A head says, the crown fears the traitor enough to silence him. I don't fear him. I'm the king. You're the regent. And regents, I'm the king. Father is dead. Father is going to die. Everyone knows it. The maesters know it. You know it. Father got killed by a pig, and I'm the king. And I want the traitors. Enough. The voice came from behind. The voice came from the doors. The voice was enormous. The voice that had shattered Rhaegar Targaryen's chest on the trident. The voice that had called the banners at Storm's End. The voice that had been silent for 9 days, and that was now filling the throne room with the sound of Robert Baratheon refusing to be dead. The waking. What the king found. Robert Baratheon stood in the doorway of the throne room. He should not have been standing. The maesters had said 2 weeks minimum before movement. The wound was healing, but the healing was fragile. The stitches holding, the infection fought back by the poultices and the boiled wine that the maesters applied 3 times daily, but the holding and the fighting were the fragile kind that required rest, and that movement would destroy. Robert should have been in bed. Robert should have been sleeping. Robert should have been following the maesters' prescriptions with the obedience that the prescriptions required. Robert was standing in the doorway of the throne room because the Kingsguard knight posted at his door, Sir Mandon Moore, the man whose face expressed nothing, and whose nothing was loyalty to whoever held power, had told Robert, when Robert woke up and demanded to know what was happening, that the prince was holding court. The prince is holding, Robert had said. Still in bed, still bleeding, the wounds seeping through the bandages, the blood returning with each movement. The prince is holding court? Prince Joffrey sits the Iron Throne as regent, your grace. The Queen what? Sir Mandon told him. Sir Mandon told him, because Sir Mandon's loyalty calculation updated in real time, the king was awake. The king was furious. The king was alive. And the alive and furious king outranked the queen in Sir Mandon's arithmetic of power. Sir Mandon told Robert everything. The arrest of the Hand, the Gold Cloak's assault on the tower, the Northern Guards killed, Ned in the black cells, Joffrey on the throne. Robert stood up. The standing up tore the stitches. The blood came, fresh blood, the bright red of reopened wounds, soaking through the sleeping shirt. Robert did not stop. Robert walked. Robert walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, the king in his sleeping clothes, blood on his belly, barefoot on the stone. The walking producing the sound of flat feet and heavy breathing, and the occasional grunt of pain that Robert suppressed, because suppressing pain was the Baratheon method. Robert walked into the throne room. The throne room went silent. The silence was the collective suspension of every voice and every breath in a room that had been watching Joffrey play at kingship and that was now watching the actual king walk through the door, bloody, enormous, furious, alive, looking like what Robert Baratheon actually was when the crown and the robes and the fat were stripped away. A warrior, a wounded warrior, a warrior who was about to break something. Get off my throne. The command was directed at Joffrey. The command was Robert, pure Robert. The Robert who did not negotiate, who did not discuss, who did not explore the nuances of political arrangements. The Robert who said, I am the king, and you are not, and the not being king means you get off the throne now. Joffrey looked at his father. The looking was fear, genuine fear, the fear that Joffrey kept buried under the cruelty, the fear that emerged when the cruelty met something bigger. Joffrey's cruelty was a child's cruelty. Robert's fury was a grown man's fury, the fury of a man who had killed a prince and broken a dynasty, and who was now looking at a boy sitting in his chair, and whose looking was the promise of violence. Father, you were sitting on my throne. While I was bleeding, Robert looked at Cersei. The looking was different from the looking at Joffrey. The looking at Cersei was the recognition. The recognition that said, you did this. You used my wound. You used the time. You built this while I bled. Robert, you should be in bed. Where is Ned? The question hit the room. The question scattered the courtiers the way stones scattered birds. The question sending people stepping back, moving toward the walls, creating distance between themselves and the fury, because fury in a king was the lightning, and lightning struck the closest thing. Lord Stark is, Cersei began. Where is Ned Stark? Lord Stark was arrested for treason. Lord Stark plotted to seize. Ned Stark has never plotted a bloody thing in his life. Ned Stark doesn't know what plotting is. Ned Stark is the most honest man in the Seven Kingdoms, and the most honest man in the Seven Kingdoms is in my dungeons, and the only person in this room who plots is... Robert stopped. Not because Robert ran out of words, because Robert ran out of breath. The wound. The wound was the limitation. The wound was the chain. The wound was the price of standing and walking and screaming, when standing and walking and screaming were the things that would kill him if the boar hadn't. Robert swayed. The swaying was visible, the king swaying in the throne room, the blood on his shirt expanding, the body saying what the mouth would not, I am not healed. I am not strong. I am the king, and the king is made of meat, and the meat is failing. Barristan caught him. Barristan, who had been 2 steps behind the king since the king left his chambers, who had tried to stop Robert, and who had failed because stopping Robert Baratheon was the thing that no one had ever accomplished. Barristan caught the king's arm and held Robert upright with the strength of a man who had been holding things upright for 50 years. Free Ned Stark, Robert said. Not to Cersei, to Barristan, to the Kingsguard, to the room. Free him now. Bring him to my chambers. And someone. Robert looked at Joffrey, who was still on the throne, frozen, the boy's cruelty replaced by the boy's terror. Someone get that boy off my throne before I throw him off it. Joffrey scrambled off the throne. The scrambling was not dignified. The scrambling was a boy fleeing, the legs working faster than the pride could manage, the prince running from his father with the speed that fear produced and that cruelty could not match. Robert turned to Cersei. Robert's turn towards Cersei began what would come next, the conversation that would happen in private. The confrontation that Robert had been avoiding since before the hunt, and that the hunt had postponed, and that the wound had delayed, and that could not be delayed anymore, because delay had become cowardice, and cowardice had become the habit that Robert was done with. You and I, Robert said, to Cersei. Quiet now, the fury banked, the volume reduced. The voice dropping to the register that was more dangerous than the screaming, Because screaming served as performance, but the quiet held truth. You and I are going to talk. About the children. About their hair. About their father. About everything. And you are going to tell me the truth. Or I am going to do the thing that Ned has been telling me to do since he arrived in this stinking city. Do you understand? Cersei looked at Robert. Cersei looked at Robert with the eyes of a woman who had spent 20 years married to a man she hated, and who had survived the hatred through contempt, and who was now, for the first time, looking at Robert with something that was not contempt. Something older. Something from before the marriage, before the hatred, before the golden children and the golden brother. Something that might have been fear. I understand, Cersei said. Good, now get out of my throne room. All of you, get out. They got out. The throne room emptied with the speed that fury commanded. The courtiers and guards and hangers on streaming through the doors with the collective urgency of people who had just witnessed a dead king come back to life, and who were now trying to calculate what the coming back meant for their positions and their safety and their heads. Robert stood alone in the throne room. Robert and Barristan, the king and the knight, the wounded man and the old man. The throne room was empty, and the Iron Throne was empty, and the emptiness was the question, what now? Get me to my chambers, Robert said. And bring Ned. Bring Ned, and bring wine. And don't. Robert looked at Barristan. The look was the look that Robert gave when the pride had been spent, and the strength had been spent, and the being king had been spent for the day, and what was left was the man. Just the man. Just Robert. Don't let me fall in the corridor. I won't give her that. You won't fall, Your Grace. I might. Then I'll catch you. As I always have. Robert laughed. The laugh was small, not the great, booming Robert laugh that filled halls and shook cups and made serving girls blush and made Cersei flinch. The small laugh. The real laugh. The laugh of a man who had just survived a boar and survived his wife and survived his own absence, and who was now going to walk back to his chambers without falling, and the not falling was the victory, and the victory was the only one Robert would win today. Robert walked. Barristan walked beside him. The king left the throne room, and the throne room was empty, and the emptiness was the pause between the old world and the new world, between the 9 days of Cersei's building and the beginning of Robert's tearing down. The tearing down was going to be worse than the building. The tearing down always was. The hand. What the darkness taught. Ned Stark came out of the black cells, the way men came out of black cells, blinking, thin, disoriented, with the sour stench of a man who had spent 9 days in darkness and filth, and the company of rats whose company was better than the loneliness, because at least the rats were honest about wanting to eat you. Barristan brought Ned to Robert's chambers. Ned walked on legs that were unsteady, from 9 days of sitting and sitting again in a space too small for walking. Walked through corridors that were bright after the darkness. Walked past guards who had arrested him 9 days ago, and who were now stepping aside, because the king had spoken, and the king's word carried the force of law. Ned entered Robert's chambers. Robert was in bed, back in bed, because the standing and the walking and the screaming had reopened the wound, and his fury had reopened the wound, and the price was blood and pain, and the grey pallor of a man who had spent more blood than the body could spare. Robert looked at Ned. Ned looked at Robert. The looking lasted. You look terrible, Robert said. You look worse. I got stabbed by a pig. I got stabbed by your wife. Robert laughed. The laugh cost. The cost was the pain in the belly, the stitches pulling, the wound protesting the movement that laughter required. But the laughter came anyway, because laughter between Robert and Ned was the language. The language that 18 years of friendship had built, and that 18 years of separation had not destroyed, and that 9 days of dungeons and boars could not reach. Sit, Robert said. Sit before you fall. You look like you've been in a dungeon. I have been in a dungeon. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't. I was. Robert gestured at his belly. At the bandages. At the blood that was seeping through again because the bandages were fresh, and the freshness didn't matter when the wound refused to hold. I was dealing with a pig, while your wife was dealing with me. While my wife, Robert's face changed. The change was the arrival of the reality that Robert had been avoiding since waking up, since the throne room, since the confrontation with Cersei. The reality that Cersei had arrested his hand and imprisoned his friend and put his son on his throne and done all of it while Robert bled and slept and did not know. The reality was the betrayal, and the betrayal was the beginning, and what followed would be the conversation that Robert needed to have and that Robert did not want to have, because the conversation was the truth and the truth was the devastation. Tell me, Robert said. Tell you what? Don't play the game, Ned. You told me before the hunt. You told me things. Things about Cersei, things about the children. I was drunk, and I was angry, and I went hunting instead of listening. Because hunting is what I do when I don't want to hear, and I didn't want to hear. And the not hearing was the pig, and the pig was... Tell me again. Tell me what you told me. All of it. From the beginning. Ned told him. Ned told Robert about Jon Arryn's investigation. The investigation that Jon had conducted before his death. The investigation that led Jon to the Book of Lineages, and the Book of Lineages to the bastards, and the bastards to the truth. Ned told Robert about the bastards, Robert's bastards, the black-haired children scattered across King's Landing. The children who looked like Robert because the children were Robert's, and whose looking like Robert was the evidence. Every Baratheon child, for hundreds of years, had the black hair. Every single one. The Baratheon seed was strong. The phrase from Jon Arryn's book. The phrase that Jon had repeated to his squire in the days before his death. The phrase that was the code for the truth. Every Baratheon child had black hair. Joffrey was golden. Myrcella was golden. Tommen was golden. 3 golden-haired children born to a black-haired father. 3 golden-haired children who did not look like Robert and who looked exactly like Jaime Lannister. The children are Jaime's, Ned said. The sentence sat in the room. Robert had heard it before. Robert had heard it before the hunt, heard it from Ned, heard the words that should have changed everything, and that Robert had processed by not processing, by pouring wine and shouting for horses and riding into the Kingswood, because the Kingswood was the place where Robert went to kill things, and killing things was the substitute for thinking. But the Kingswood had done its work. The Boar had done its work. 9 days of poppy sleep had done their work. And Robert, lying in his bed with a hole in his belly and the hole's twin in his heart, could not ride into the forest again, could not kill anything, could not run. I know, Robert said. I know. I've known. Not known. Not the way you know, with your evidence and your books and your bastards counting. I've known the way a man knows when his wife looks at another man, and the looking is the truth that the man won't face. I've known since Joffrey was 3. Since Joffrey was 3, and I looked at the boy and I saw Cersei. Only Cersei. Nothing of me. Not a damn thing. I looked at my son, and I saw her brother, and I told myself I was seeing what jealous men see, and I drank until the seeing stopped. Robert, 17 years. Ned, 17 years of drinking until the seeing stopped. 17 years of looking at those children, and knowing, and telling myself I didn't know, because knowing meant destruction. Knowing meant the end of everything. Knowing led to war, and the war was Robert stopped. Not because of pain, because of grief. The grief that sat beneath the rage. The grief of a man who had spent 17 years raising children who were not his, and loving children who were not his, and hating a wife whose hatred was the mirror of his own, and whose mirror reflected the truth that Robert could not face. What do you want to do? Ned asked. What do I want to do? I want to kill her. I want to kill Jaime. I want to. Robert looked at his hands. The hands that had swung the warhammer. The hands that had crushed Rhaegar's chest. The hands that were now the hands of a fat, wounded man in a bed, and whose holding the warhammer was the memory and the memory was the ghost of who Robert used to be. I want to kill them both, and I can't. I can't, because the killing is the war, and the war is the Lannisters, and the Lannisters are... Ned, how many men does Tywin have? 60,000. 60,000. And I have the Stormlands, the North, the Riverlands, through my wife's family. The Vale, possibly. Lisa is unpredictable, but Jon Arryn's memory carries weight. The Crown's forces, against Lannister gold and Lannister steel. And the Reach? The Reach hasn't declared. The Reach waits. The Reach always waits. The Reach waits to see who wins, and then the Reach joins the winner and calls it loyalty. I know the Tyrells. Mace Tyrell sat outside Storm's End for a year during the rebellion and called a siege what was actually a picnic. The Tyrells will do whatever the Tyrells do, which is nothing, until the nothing becomes something, and then the Tyrells will claim they were always on the winning side. Robert shifted in the bed. The shifting cost, the wound, the stitches, the body's protest against the movements that the body required and the mind demanded. Robert shifted, and Robert looked at Ned, and Robert's face did the thing that Robert's face rarely did. The thing that was not rage, not grief, not the booming performance that Robert deployed as armor. Robert's face showed the man, the tired, wounded, lost man who had spent 17 years failing at the one job the gods had given him, and who was now lying in a bed trying to decide what to do about the fact that his children were not his children, and his wife had betrayed him in the most complete way that betrayal could be. Accomplished. What would you do? Robert asked. If you were me? I wouldn't be you. Don't give me honor, Ned. Give me an answer. Ned was silent. The silence was the thinking, the honest, stark thinking, the thinking that processed problems through the filter of what was right, and that produced answers that were right, and that were also, frequently, politically suicidal. Denounce the children, Ned said. Strip them of their names. Strip them of the succession. Cersei faces trial before the faith for adultery and treason. Jaime faces trial for fucking my wife, for treason. The Kingsguard oath forbids. The Kingsguard oath forbids a lot of things. Jaime broke the oath when he killed Aerys. Jaime broke the oath when Robert's hand found the wine cup. The wine cup was empty. The wine cup had been empty since Robert woke up, because the maesters had removed the wine, because the wine was the enemy of healing, and the enemy of healing was the friend of Robert Baratheon, and the friendship was the problem. Someone get me wine, Robert said. The maesters said. The maesters said no wine. The maesters said no movement. The maesters said lie in bed and heal. I'm not lying in bed. I'm not healing. I'm sitting here talking about my wife's brother's cock, and I need wine. Ned looked at Barristan. Barristan looked at Ned. The looking exchanged the message. Give him the wine. Give him the wine. Because refusing the wine is the fight, and the fight is not the priority, and the priority is the conversation, and the conversation requires wine. Because wine was Robert's fuel, and Robert without fuel was Robert without words, and words were the thing they needed. Wine was brought. Robert drank, and Robert drank with the ritual devotion of a man returning to the only habit that had never betrayed him, the only companion that had never lied to him, the only relationship in Robert Baratheon's life that functioned exactly as it was supposed to. If I denounce the children, Robert said. Through the wine, Tywin marches. Tywin may march regardless. Tywin's forces are already in the Riverlands. The Mountain has been raiding the Riverlands for weeks, burning villages, killing small folk. Tywin sent him. Tywin sent the Mountain before this. Tywin sent the Mountain because Catelyn arrested Tyrion. Because Catelyn, Ned stopped. Ned stopped, recognizing that the chain of events was the chain, and the chain connected everything. Catelyn had arrested Tyrion because Ned had sent her evidence about the dagger that had been used to try to kill Bran, the dagger that Littlefinger had said belonged to Tyrion. The chain went. Bran's fall, the dagger, Littlefinger's lie, Catelyn's arrest, Tywin's response. Every link connected. Every link led to the next disaster. Everything is connected, Ned said. Everything in this city connects to everything else, and every thread I pull unravels something worse. Welcome to being Hand. Welcome to the job I gave you. Welcome to thee. Robert drank more wine. Welcome to King's Landing, where nothing is simple and nobody tells the truth, and the only honest man in the city spent 9 days in a dungeon for the crime of being honest. I need to send a raven to Catelyn. Send your raven. Send all the ravens. Tell the North that the king lives. Tell the North that the Hand is free. Tell the North that Robert paused. The pause was the decision arriving. The decision that Robert had been circling since waking up, since the throne room, since the black cells and the confrontation and the truth and the wine. The decision that everything led to, and that everything depended on, and that Robert could not postpone, because postponement had been cowardice, and the cowardice had fed the boar, and the pig was dumb. Tell the North that the king summons his banners. Tell the Stormlands. Tell the Riverlands. Tell them all. Because when I denounce those children, and I am going to denounce them, Ned, I'm going to stand in the throne room and tell the world that Cersei Lannister's children are Jaime Lannister's children. When I do that, Tywin Lannister is going to come for me with every sword in the West. And I intend to be ready. You can barely stand. I can barely stand today. Give me a month. Give me a month and I'll stand. Give me 2 months and I'll ride. Give me 3 and I'll swing a warhammer again. You won't swing a warhammer again. I will. I will. Because this, Robert's hand went to his belly, to the wound, to the place where the boar had entered and the world had changed. This is the gods telling me to wake up. This is the gods saying, you wasted 17 years. You drank and you whored and you sat on a throne you didn't earn. And you let a Lannister woman make a fool of you. The gods sent the pig. The gods sent the pig to wake me up. The gods didn't send the pig, Robert. Then what sent the pig? A pig sent the pig. And Lancel Lannister sent the wine. The sentence landed. The sentence was the second truth, the second bomb, detonating in the same hour as the first. The sentence said, the wine that Lancel poured, the wine that was too strong, the wine that slowed Robert's reflexes and dulled Robert's aim and put the boar's tusk in Robert's belly instead of Robert's spear in the boar's heart. The wine was not an accident. The wine was a weapon. Lancel, Robert said. Cersei's cousin. Cersei's, Ned chose his words. Cersei gave him instructions. The wine was strong wine. Not the hunting wine. Lancel kept your cup full because Cersei told him to keep your cup full. Because Cersei wanted me dead. The sentence was flat. Not the fury. Not the grief. Something else. Something older than both. The understanding. The understanding of a man who had just learned that his wife had tried to murder him, and whose learning was not the shock, because the shock required surprise, and there was no surprise. There was only the confirmation. The confirmation of the truth that Robert had been living inside for 17 years. The truth that Cersei hated him, and that the hatred was mutual, and that the mutuality had been the marriage, and the marriage had been the war, and the war was now over, because the war had produced its final casualty, which was the pretense. She wanted me dead, Robert repeated. The wine. The boar. She wanted me dead so her bastards could sit on my throne, and her brother could. Robert stopped. Her brother. Her twin. The Kingslayer. The man who killed Aerys to save the city, and then spent the next 20 years fucking the Queen in the same castle where he killed the last king who... Robert. Don't Robert me. Don't. Robert threw the wine cup. The cup hit the wall, and the wine sprayed, and the throw was Robert's release. A physical release. The body doing what the mind needed. The violence that was not a punch or a hammer swing, but a cup against a wall, and the cup was enough, because the cup was the anger, and the anger needed to go somewhere. She tried to kill me. Ned, my wife. The mother of. They're not my children. She tried to kill me. She locked you in a cell. She put a child on my throne. And I let this happen. I let all of it happen. I married the woman. and I drank my way through the marriage, and I let her put golden-haired bastards in the nursery, and I let her run the city, and I let everything. You didn't let. I let. I let because letting was easier than fighting, and fighting Cersei was the one fight I never wanted. Because fighting Cersei meant facing Cersei, and facing Cersei meant facing myself, and facing myself was... Robert looked at Ned. The look was raw, the look that Robert gave only to Ned, only to the one person in the world that Robert trusted with the real, the underneath. The Robert who was not the king, and not the warrior, and not the drunk, but the boy. The boy from Storm's End, who had lost his parents, and who had loved a girl who died, and who had won a kingdom he didn't want, and who had spent 17 years proving that winning was not the same as deserving. "Help me," Robert said. "Help me fix this. I don't know how to fix this. I know how to fight. I know how to drink. I know how to break things. I don't know how to fix them. That's your job. That's why I brought you south. That's why Ned, I need you to tell me what to do." Ned looked at Robert. Ned looked at his oldest friend. The friend who was bleeding and broken and drunk and lost. The friend who had been king for 17 years and who had learned nothing from the kingship except that the crown was heavy and the wine was sweet and the combination was the ruin. The friend who was asking for help and whose asking was the first honest thing Robert had done since putting the crown on his head. "First," Ned said, "we secure Cersei. Cersei and Jaime, they're in the Red Keep, the cells. Both of them, guarded by men who answer to you, not to her. Jaime is in the King's Guard. Jaime is a traitor. Strip his white cloak, put him in chains. And Cersei? Cersei is a prisoner, not a queen, not a wife. A prisoner who attempted to murder the king and who conspired to put illegitimate children on the throne. The charges are treason. The penalty is death. The penalty is death. But the executing, Robert, the executing is the war. Tywin Lannister will not permit his daughter to be executed. Tywin will march. Then, Tywin marches, and when Tywin marches, I crush him. The way I crushed the Targaryens. The way You crushed the Targaryens at 20. You're 36 with a hole in your belly. The crushing is not guaranteed. The crushing is Robert Baratheon with a warhammer and a grievance. The crushing has always been guaranteed. The crushing was guaranteed when you were young and strong and sober. You're none of those things. The honesty hit. The honesty hit because Ned's honesty always hit. The northern honesty, the blunt assessment delivered without padding. Because padding was the southern art, and the southern art was the lie, and Ned Stark did not lie. Robert was not young. Robert was not strong. Robert was not sober. Robert was a fat, wounded, drunk man in a bed, and the gap between what Robert was and what Robert remembered being was the gap that 17 years of the throne had carved, and that the throne would continue to carve until the carving reached bone. "Then what?" Robert asked. "Quiet now. The fury spent. The wine working. If I can't crush him myself." "What?" "You don't have to crush him yourself. You have the realm. You have the north, 30,000 men. You have the Stormlands, 20,000. You have the Riverlands, 10, maybe 15,000. You have Stannis. Stannis has Dragonstone. Stannis has the royal fleet. Stannis hates me. Stannis doesn't hate you. Stannis resents you. There's a difference. Hatred is hot. Resentment is cold. And Stannis will answer when the king calls, because answering is duty, and duty is the only language that Stannis speaks. Stannis will answer because Stannis has been telling everyone that the children aren't mine. Stannis figured it out before any of us. Stannis. Robert laughed. The laugh was bitter. The bitter laugh. The laugh that Robert laughed when the joke was on him, and the joke was always on him. Stannis was right. Stannis is always right. That's what makes Stannis so miserable, being right all the time and having nobody listen. Call your banners, Robert. Call them now. Before Tywin can move. Before the ravens carry the news west. Call the north. the Stormlands, the Riverlands. Call Stannis. Put the realm on a war footing. And then, when the realm is behind you, and the swords are mustered, and the position is strong, then you denounce the children. Then you arrest Cersei. Then you give Tywin the choice. Accept the king's justice, or fight the king's war. And Tywin will choose war. Tywin will choose whatever serves Tywin. And if the choice is between war against 4 kingdoms and negotiation that saves his name, Tywin will calculate. Tywin always calculates. Tywin calculates. Tywin calculated the rains. Tywin calculated the Tarbecks. Tywin calculated the sack of King's Landing. Tywin's calculations end in blood. Then we make sure we have more blood to spend than he does. Robert looked at Ned. Robert looked at Ned with the gaze of a king looking at the one man he trusted. The gaze held gratitude, not spoken, not expressed in words, because Robert Baratheon did not express gratitude in words, because words were the tools of diplomats, and Robert was not a diplomat. Robert was a hammer, and the hammer was grateful to the hand that guided it. Stay, Robert said. Stay in King's Landing. Stay as hand. Don't leave me to do this alone. I'll make a mess of it alone. I'll stay. Promise me. The words that echoed through 18 years, echoed from a tower in Dawn, where a woman had said the same words, and Ned had kept the promise, and the keeping had cost Ned everything. Promise me, the words that Robert said without knowing what they echoed, and that Ned heard knowing exactly what they echoed, and the knowledge weighed on Ned, and the weight came from the promise within the promise, the secret, Jon. The truth about Lyanna's son that Ned carried, and that Robert could never know. Because the knowing would be the death of the boy, and the death of the boy would be the death of the promise, and the death of the promise would be the death of Ned's honor. I promise, Ned said, the lion's daughter. What Cersei chose, Cersei Lannister was put in a tower cell on the evening of the 9th day. Not the black cells, not the dungeons. A tower cell, a room in Maegor's holdfast, with a window and a bed and a lock on the door and guards outside, who were Baratheon men, not Lannister men, and whose Baratheon-ness was the difference between imprisonment and execution. The tower cell was the compromise between Robert's fury and Ned's pragmatism. Jaime was harder. Jaime Lannister, Sir Jaime of the Kingsguard, the Kingslayer, the Golden Lion. Jaime was in the White Sword Tower when the order came. The order came through Barristan's Selmy, because Barristan was the Lord Commander, and the Lord Commander was the authority that Jaime might obey, and might not, and the might not was the danger. Barristan found Jaime in the White Sword Tower's common room. Jaime was cleaning his sword, the casual maintenance of a man who cleaned his sword the way other men cleaned their teeth. Not because it was necessary, but because it was habit, and habit was the structure that held men together when everything else fell apart. The king has ordered your arrest, Barristan said. Jaime looked up from the sword. The looking up was slow, the slow, lazy look that Jaime gave to everything. The look that said, I have heard surprising things before, and this is not surprising, because nothing surprises me, because I killed a king at 17, and killing a king at 17 set a ceiling, and nothing since has risen high enough to surprise. Has he? Sir Jaime. Put down the sword. The sword is already down, Sir Barristan. It's on a cloth. I'm polishing it. The king has ordered. I heard what the king ordered. The king ordered my arrest. The king who has been lying in a bed for 9 days while his wife ran his kingdom. The king has ordered the arrest of the man who has been guarding that bed for 9 of those days. The irony is, what's the word when irony becomes something else? Something thicker? Sir Jaime. Something thicker than irony. Something that tastes like iron and sounds like laughter and feels like, tragedy. That's the word. The irony becomes tragedy. I've been guarding the king while the king's wife locks up the king's friend and puts the king's son on the king's throne. And now the king wakes up and arrests me. Because I fucked the queen. Because the children, Jaime stopped. Jaime stopped, arriving at the edge that Jaime had been dancing along for 20 years. The edge between the secret and the world, the edge between the lie and the truth. The edge between Jaime Lannister the Kingsguard and Jaime Lannister the father. Because the children are mine, Jaime said. Not loudly, not defiantly, with a flatness that was worse than defiance. The flatness of a man who had been carrying a weight for 20 years, and who was now setting the weight down, and the setting down was the relief, and the relief was the exhaustion, and the exhaustion was the truth. Put down the sword, Sir Jaime, come with me. And if I don't, then I will take you, and one of us will die. And the dying will be pointless, because the dying will not change the truth, and the truth is that the king knows, and the knowing is the end. Jaime looked at Barristan. Jaime looked at the old knight, the legendary knight. The knight who was everything that Jaime should have been, and that Jaime's choices had prevented. Barristan Selmy, who had served 3 kings and never broken a vow. Barristan Selmy, who had killed in battle and protected in peace, and who had been a Kingsguard in the way that Kingsguards were supposed to be. Jaime looked at Barristan, and Jaime saw the judgment. The judgment that said, you dishonored the white cloak. You dishonored everything the cloak meant. I didn't dishonor it, Jaime said, soft, almost to himself. The cloak was already dishonored when they gave it to me. The cloak was dishonored when Aerys wore it. When Aerys used the Kingsguard as, we stood outside the door. Sir Barristan, you and I, we stood outside the door while Aerys raped his wife, and we listened to the screaming, and we did nothing, because the cloak said protect the king, and the king raped his wife, and the cloak covered the crime. I broke one vow. One, and the breaking saved the city. The breaking saved 500,000 people from burning. And the realm gave me a name for the breaking, Kingslayer. The realm took the one good thing I did, and turned it into the sword, Sir Jaime. Jaime put down the sword. Jaime stood. Jaime held out his hands, the golden hands, the swordsman's hands. The hands that had killed a king and fathered 3 children, and that were now being bound in chains because fathering children had become the crime, while killing a king had not. The things I do for love, Jaime said. Barristan took Jaime to the cells. Not the black cells, a tower cell, like Cersei's. Because Barristan understood that a Lannister in chains was a provocation, and a provocation was a calculation, and the calculation was, how much can Tywin tolerate before Tywin marches? The tower cells were the limit. The tower cells said, your children are prisoners, not condemned. The tower cells said, there is room for negotiation. The tower cells said, the king is angry, not murderous. The distinction between angry and murderous was the space in which diplomacy operated. The distinction was shrinking. The children. What innocence cost? The children were the problem that nobody wanted to solve. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen. 3 children. 3 golden-haired children who had been prince and princess and prince, and who were now bastard and bastard and bastard, their names changing from Baratheon to, what? Waters? Hill? The bastard names depended on the geography, and the geography was the confusion, because the children were born in King's Landing, but their father was from the Westerlands, and the jurisdiction of bastardy was a question that the law had never anticipated, because the law had never anticipated a queen cuckolding a king with her own brother. What happens to them? Ned asked. The question was asked in Robert's chambers. The question was asked on the 11th day, 2 days after Robert's waking. 2 days of planning and summoning, and the construction of the case against Cersei that Ned was building with the methodical precision that Ned brought to everything. The case was the architecture, and the architecture required answers to questions that the architecture could not avoid. What happens to what? The children. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, Robert's face did something ugly. The ugly was the hatred. The hatred for the children who were not his. The hatred that mixed with the memory of the loving, because Robert had loved them, in Robert's way, in the distracted, absent, half-drunk way that Robert loved everything, and the loving had been real even if the fathering had been false. They're bastards. They're children. Tommen is 8. Myrcella is. Myrcella is Jaime's daughter. Tommen is Jaime's son. Joffrey is Jaime's. Robert's hand closed on the wine cup. The fist closed as anger arrived. Joffrey sat on my throne. Joffrey ordered my hand executed. Joffrey, that boy is dangerous, Ned. That boy is 13. That boy is 13 and cruel and stupid, and the cruelty and the stupidity are his mother's gifts, and what happens to them, Robert? The question requires an answer. The answer determines whether Tywin negotiates or marches. If you execute the children, I'm not going to execute children. Good. Then what? Robert drank. Robert drank to delay, the tactic Robert used when the decision was the kind of decision that Robert hated, the political kind, the kind that required calculation instead of strength, and that Robert could not solve with a hammer. The Faith, Robert said. Send them to the Faith. Tommen goes to a sept. The boys go too. What do boys go to? A monastery. The Silent Brothers. Somewhere where the boy takes vows and the vows prevent him from inheriting, and the preventing is the safety, and the safety is... And Joffrey? Joffrey takes the black. Joffrey is 13. Men take the black at 13. Your bastard. Jon Snow. Jon Snow is going to the wall. 15, isn't he? The mention of Jon hit Ned. The mention of Jon always hit Ned. The mention of the boy who was not Robert's, and who was not Ned's, and whose not being was the secret, and the secret was the weight, and the weight was the thing that Ned carried alongside every other weight, and that was heavier than all of them. Jon is different. Jon is a bastard going to the wall. Joffrey is a bastard going to the wall. The wall doesn't care who's bastard. The wall takes them all. The wall is voluntary. You can't force a boy to take vows. I'm the king. I can force anything. The boy takes the black, or the boy sits in a cell for the rest of his life. Those are the options. The boy is dangerous. The boy has spent 13 years believing he's a prince, and the unbelieving is the breaking, and the breaking is the danger. A broken prince who thinks he's been cheated, that's the rebellion. Ned, that's the future rebellion. That's the boy who comes back in 20 years with a foreign army and says, the throne is mine, and the taking back is the justice. Ned looked at Robert. Ned's face was the Stark face, the face that processed difficult truths through the filter of what was right, and that produced the grimace that meant, this is ugly, and the ugliness is the reality, and the reality is the thing I have to work with. Send Tommen to the Faith. Send Marcella to the Silent Sisters. Joffrey goes to the wall. Not as punishment, as mercy, as the king's mercy to children who didn't choose their parents. Mercy, the word matters, Robert. Call it punishment, and Tywin fights. Call it mercy, and Tywin can accept mercy. Tywin cannot accept punishment. The difference between the words is the difference between war and peace. I don't want peace with Tywin Lannister. You need peace with Tywin Lannister. You need peace long enough to rebuild, long enough to heal, long enough to find a new wife and produce a real heir and stabilize the succession. War now is what Tywin wants. War now is Robert Baratheon wounded and angry and leading an army with a hole in his belly. War later is Robert Baratheon healed and allied and surrounded by 70,000 swords. War later assumes Tywin waits. Tywin waits if Tywin's children are alive and Tywin's grandchildren are alive, and the alive is the leverage. The dead have no leverage. The living have all of it. Robert considered. The considering was visible. The jaw working, the eyes narrowing, the body doing the things that Robert's body did when Robert's mind was active, which was rare. Because Robert's mind was usually drowned in wine, and the drowning kept Robert absent, and the absence defined the governance by neglect that had defined Robert's reign. But not now. Now Robert was. Something different. Something that the boar had produced, not in the body, but in the mind. The boar had produced the waking up. The boar had produced the moment that Robert had been avoiding for 17 years. The moment of engagement. The moment of actually being king instead of performing king. The moment of sitting in the chair and making the decisions that the chair required. Fine, Robert said. The children live. The children go to the faith or the wall. The children are mercy. The word is mercy. But Cersei tried to murder Me. Cersei is not mercy. Cersei is a trial. Before the faith. Let the High Septon judge her. Let the gods judge her. Don't let Robert Baratheon judge her, because Robert Baratheon judging Cersei Lannister is not justice, it's revenge. And revenge is what kings cannot afford. Kings can afford anything. Kings can afford anything except the appearance of tyranny. And executing your wife without trial, even a wife who deserves executing, is the tyranny that the realm remembers. Aerys killed without trial. Aerys burned men without evidence. If Robert Baratheon executes Cersei Lannister without a trial, Robert Baratheon becomes, don't say it. You become the thing you overthrew. The sentence sat. The sentence was the cold water thrown on the fire of Robert's fury. The cold water that Ned threw, because Ned was the only person in the world who could throw cold water on Robert and survive. Trial, Robert said. The word tasted like vinegar. The word tasted like compromise, and compromise was the thing that Robert hated, because compromise was the political thing, and the political thing was the southern thing, and Robert Baratheon was a hammer, and hammers did not compromise. Trial, before the faith. Before the faith. And I swear to the gods, old and new, if the faith finds her guilty, and the faith will find her guilty, because she is guilty, if the faith finds her guilty, I want to swing the sword myself. You can't swing the sword. The king doesn't execute. The king, your people swing the sword. In the north, the man who passes the sentence swings the sword. Your way, your father's way, my way is the north's way. The south has its own way. And the south's way is the executioner. And the executioner is Ilyn Payne. And Ilyn Payne is a Lannister creature. And I'll be damned if a Lannister creature executes my wife for. Robert stopped. The stopping was not the words running out. Robert stopped because the absurdity landed. The absurdity of a man discussing who would kill his wife. The absurdity of the situation that Robert's life had become. The absurdity of a king lying in a bed with a hole in his gut, arguing about the protocol of beheading the woman he had married 17 years ago, in a ceremony that had been the beginning of everything that had gone wrong. We'll discuss the executioner later, Ned said. Later, always later. Everything is later. Later is the word that smart men use when the present contains too many problems. First the trial. First the ravens. First the banners. The executioner is later. Robert drank, and the cup became the contract, because Robert could not agree to anything sober for Robert, and drinking without agreement was the default. Robert drank, and Robert agreed, and the agreement marked a beginning, the start of a plan, the beginning of the response, the beginning of the reckoning that had been 17 years in the making, and that was now arriving with the force of a boar's tusk, and the inevitability of a truth that could no longer be denied. The lion. What Tywin answered. The raven reached Tywin Lannister at Harrenhal on a morning when the fog sat on the god's eye like a burial shroud. Tywin read the message in his solar, the solar that Harren the Black had built for comfort, and that 300 years of subsequent lords had failed to make comfortable, because Harrenhal was not designed for comfort. Harrenhal was designed for dominance, and the dominance was the architecture, and the architecture was the ruin, because dragons had melted the dominance and left the ruin, and the ruin was where Tywin sat and read the message that changed everything. The message said, Robert lives. The message said, Cersei arrested. The message said, Jaime in chains. The message said, the children declared bastards. Tywin put the message down. Tywin did not react. Tywin Lannister's face was the mask. The Lannister mask. The mask that Tywin had worn since the day Tywin decided that the world would never see him vulnerable, and that the decision was the power, because the power was the denial, and the denial was the mask, and the mask was the face, and the face was the Lord of Casterly Rock. Kevan, Tywin said. Kevan Lannister entered. Kevan, Tywin's brother, the reliable brother, the foundation brother. Kevin entered, and Kevin saw Tywin's face, and Kevin knew, from 40 years of reading the mask, that the mask was under strain. "Read it," Tywin said. Kevin read. Kevin's face did what Tywin's face would not. Reacted. The reaction was visible. The tightening, the paling. The physical response to the information that Kevin's politics could not suppress. "Cersei," Kevin said. "Cersei. And Jaime. And Jaime. And the children. All of it. Everything that Cersei built. Everything that Cersei's stupidity produced. Everything that I warned her about. Warned her. Kevin, I warned her. I told her to be careful. I told her that the risk." Tywin stopped. Tywin stopped himself, reasserting the iron control he exercised over himself with the same iron discipline that Tywin exercised over his armies and his bannermen and his family. Tywin did not rant. Tywin did not rave. Tywin processed. "What are the options?" Kevin asked. The options are war or negotiation, and the war is the destruction, and the negotiation is the humiliation, and the choice between destruction and humiliation is the choice that Cersei has given me by being too stupid to keep her legs closed. The sentence was the anger. The sentence was as close to uncontrolled anger as Tywin Lannister came. The anger that broke through the mask in the form of crude language, and the crude language was the tell, and the tell said. Tywin was furious. Not at Robert, not at Ned, at Cersei. At the daughter whose appetites had endangered the house, and whose endangering was the betrayal, and the betrayal was the familial kind, which was the worst kind. Because familial betrayals attacked the foundation, and Tywin's foundation was the family, and the family was everything. "War," Kevin said. War is 60,000 whetted swords against the north, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and the Royal Fleet. War is the arithmetic, and the arithmetic says, we lose. We lose unless the Reach joins us. And the Reach will not join us, because the Reach joined nobody in Robert's rebellion, and the Reach will not join the losing side, and the losing side is ours. Then, negotiation. Negotiation is my daughter's life, my son's life, my grandchildren's lives. Negotiation is, what does Robert want that I can give that Robert will accept, and that preserves the Lannister name? Robert wants blood. Robert wants revenge. Revenge is not the same as blood. Revenge can be satisfied with substitutes, gold, territory, submission. Revenge is the emotion, and the emotion can be managed, and the managing is the negotiation, and the negotiation is what I will do. Because the alternative is the destruction of House Lannister, and the destruction is not acceptable. Tywin stood. Tywin stood. The decision had arrived in his body before the mouth produced it, the physical response to the strategic conclusion that Tywin's mind had calculated in the time it took Kevin to read the message. "We march south," Tywin said. "Not to attack, to position. We march south with the western host, 60,000 men, and we position outside King's Landing. Not as an army of invasion, as an army of negotiation. As the physical demonstration that says, we are here, and we are strong, and the negotiation will account for our strength. An army outside King's Landing is a threat. An army outside King's Landing is a fact. The fact says, negotiate. The fact says, find a solution that preserves my daughter's life, and my son's life, and my grandchildren's lives, and my house's name. The fact says, the alternative to negotiation is a war that nobody wins, because the winning side will be so damaged by the winning that the winning is the losing. And if Robert refuses to negotiate? Tywin looked at Kevin. Tywin looked at Kevin with the eyes of a man who had spent 50 years making the world bend to his will, and who was now facing the possibility that the world would not bend, and that the not bending was the crisis. And the crisis was the thing that Tywin Lannister had never failed to solve. Robert will negotiate, Tywin said. Because Robert is not stupid. Robert is lazy and drunk and undisciplined, and Robert has wasted every gift that the gods gave him. But Robert is not stupid. Robert knows that a war with the Westerlands costs 30,000 lives and 5 years, and a treasury that is already empty. Robert will negotiate, because negotiating is cheaper than fighting, and cheaper is the argument that even a drunk king understands. And Cersei? Cersei is the price. Cersei's life is the coin that I will spend to buy the survival of the house. Cersei's life, not her death. Her life. A prison. An exile. A sept. Something that preserves the life while removing the threat. Robert can have the humiliation. Robert can have the public denouncement. Robert can have the bastard names, and the stripped titles, and the satisfaction of telling the world that Cersei Lannister is a whore. But Robert cannot have her head. The head is the line. The head is the war. And Jaime? Tywin's jaw tightened. That tightened jaw betrayed the cost of losing Jaime, the golden son, the perfect son, the son who should have been the heir, and whose white cloak had stolen the inheritance, and whose imprisonment was stealing everything else. Jaime takes the black, Tywin said. The wall, the Night's Watch, the oath that strips everything, name, inheritance, claims. Jaime on the wall is Jaime alive. Jaime alive is acceptable. Jaime dead is Jaime. Dead is war. Jaime dead is war. And the war is the destruction. And the destruction is the thing I will not permit. The Lannisters survive. Kevin, the Lannisters have survived for 4,000 years. The Lannisters survived the Andals and the Targaryens and the Rains and Robert's rebellion. The Lannisters will survive this. The Lannisters will survive Cersei's stupidity because the Lannisters have survived everything, and the surviving is the definition, and the definition is the house. Tywin began issuing orders. The orders were precise, the Tywin precision, the military precision that turned decisions into movements, and movements into positions, and positions into power. The Western host would march. The march would be measured. Not the forced march of a panicking commander, but the deliberate, visible, calculated march of a lord demonstrating strength while offering negotiation. The march said, "I am coming." The march also said, "I am willing to talk." The combination, the coming and the talking, was Tywin's strategy, and the strategy was the leverage, and the leverage was the 60,000 men moving south along the Gold Road with the banners of House Lannister snapping in the wind. The ravens flew. The ravens carried Tywin's messages, messages to the Reach, messages to Dawn, messages to the Iron Islands. The ravens were the diplomacy, and the diplomacy was the shield, and the shield protected the army, and the army protected the family, and the family was everything. Tywin Lannister rode south. Tywin rode at the head of the column, the Lord of Casterly Rock, 60 years old, rigid in the saddle, the golden armor catching the sun. Tywin rode toward King's Landing with the deliberate speed of a man who intended to arrive strong enough to negotiate, and soon enough that the negotiation could not be concluded before his arrival. Behind Tywin, the Western host. 60,000 men, the lion on every banner, the gold on every shield. The army that Tywin had built, and that Tywin commanded, and that Tywin was now deploying not to destroy a kingdom, but to save a family. The saving was going to cost. The saving always cost. The question was, how much? The denouncement. What the throne room heard. Robert denounced the children on the 14th day. The 14th day was 14 days after the Boar. 14 days of recovery, of planning, of ravens flying north and south and east, of bannermen receiving summons and armies beginning to muster, and the realm beginning the slow, grinding process of mobilizing for a crisis that everyone could feel coming, and that nobody could stop. The throne room was full. The throne room was the stage that Robert had avoided for 17 years, because Robert hated the throne room, and hated the performance, and hated the pageantry that kingship required. But today, the pageantry was the weapon. Today, the performance was the tool. Today, Robert Baratheon needed the throne room, and the throne, and the audience. Because the audience was the witness, and the witness was the legitimacy, and the legitimacy was the foundation of everything that would follow. Robert sat on the Iron Throne. Robert sat on the Iron Throne in pain, the wound still healing, the stitches still holding, the body still protesting the sitting that the body needed rest from. Robert wore the crown. The crown sat on Robert's head with the weight that crowns carried, not the physical weight, but the political weight, the symbolic weight. The weight that said, I am the king, and the king speaks, and the speaking is the law. Bring them, Robert said. They brought them. Cersei first, Cersei in chains, Cersei in the dress that the guards had given her. Cersei walked into the throne room with her chin up, because Cersei's chin was always up, and the upness was the defiance, and the defiance was the only weapon Cersei had left. Joffrey behind her. Joffrey in chains, lighter chains, the chains of a child, but chains nonetheless. Joffrey's face was the face that Cersei's face was not. Joffrey's face was fear. Pure fear. The cruelty stripped away by the stripping of titles, the bravado peeled back by the fact of chains, the boy visible beneath the prince, and the boy was afraid. Myrcella, Tommen, no chains for the youngest two. Ned had insisted, and Robert had agreed, because chaining an 8-year-old was the cruelty that even Robert's rage could not produce. Myrcella held Tommen's hand. Tommen was crying. Myrcella was not crying. Myrcella's face was the Cersei face, the controlled face. The face of a girl who was processing devastation through the filter of the Lannister training that said, never show weakness. Myrcella was 11. Myrcella should not have needed the Lannister training. But Myrcella had it, and having it was the tragedy. And the tragedy belonged to the children. Robert stood, the standing cost, the wound pulling, the body protesting, the king's flesh rebelling against the king's will. But Robert stood because standing was the authority, and the authority was the requirement. The court will hear the following decree, Robert said. The voice was the king's voice, not the Robert voice that drank and cursed and told stories about the trident, but the formal voice, the crown's voice, the voice that Robert used so rarely that the court had nearly forgotten it existed. The children known as Joffrey Baratheon, Myrcella Baratheon, and Tommen Baratheon are hereby stripped of the Baratheon name. These children are not the children of Robert Baratheon, king of the Seven Kingdoms. These children are the products of an incestuous union between Queen Cersei of House Lannister and Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard. The throne room inhaled. The throne room, every lord, every lady, every knight and servant and hanger-on, inhaled with the collective gasp of a room, hearing the truth that rumor had whispered and that the crown had now screamed. The gasp was the sound of a kingdom learning that its princes were bastards, and its queen was an adulteress, and its succession was a lie, and the lie had been the foundation, and the foundation had just been removed. Cersei did not gasp. Cersei stood in her chains and looked at Robert, and Cersei's face did not change, because Cersei's face had been prepared for this moment since the moment the guards put the chains on, and the preparation was the armor. And the armor was the Lannister pride that said, they can strip the name, but they cannot strip the blood, and the blood is Lannister, and the Lannister blood does not bow. Joffrey Waters, Robert continued, using the bastard name, using the name that bastards born in the Crownlands received. The name was the weapon, the word Waters landing in the throne room like a blade, the word replacing Baratheon, and the replacement stripped identity, a public execution of an identity. Joffrey Waters is stripped of all claims to the Iron Throne. Joffrey Waters will be sent to the wall to serve in the Night's Watch. The crown offers this as mercy, the mercy that spares the boy's life in recognition of the boy's age and the boy's ignorance of his parents' crime. I'm not going to the wall, Joffrey screamed. The scream was the boy breaking through the fear, the cruelty reasserting, the instinct that said, I am a prince, and princes do not go to the wall, and the going is the insult, and the insult demands a response. I'm the prince. You are nothing, Robert said, looking down at Joffrey from the throne, looking down at the boy who was not his son, and whose not being his son was the truth that Robert had known and denied, and that the denial had fed for 13 years. You are nothing, because your name is nothing, and your claim is nothing, and your crown, you never had a crown. You sat on my throne for 2 days. 2 days of pretending. The pretending is over. Joffrey looked at Cersei. Joffrey looked at Cersei with a child's desperation, a child looking to the mother for rescue, the child's instinct that said, "She will save me. She always saves me. She is the protector, and the protector will protect." Cersei could not protect. Cersei was in chains. Cersei looked at her son, and Cersei's face, the controlled face, the Lannister face, Cersei's face broke, not in the way that other faces broke, with tears, with collapse, with the visible disintegration of composure. Cersei's face broke from the inside. The eyes changed, the jaw tightened. The controlled face became the desperate face, became the mother's face, and the mother's face was the face that said, "I cannot save you. I cannot save you." And the not saving is the failure, and the failure is the punishment, and the punishment is worse than the chains. Myrcella waters and Tommen waters will be placed in the care of the faith, Robert continued. The voice steady, the voice holding, because the voice was the tool, and the tool did not waver. Myrcella to the silent sisters, Tommen to a sept. The faith will provide for their education and their protection. The children are innocent of their parents' crimes. The crown recognizes this innocence. The crown provides for this innocence through the mercy of the faith. Tommen was sobbing. Tommen, the 8-year-old, the gentle boy, the boy who loved cats and who flinched at violence, and who was now standing in a throne room listening to a king tell him that his name was a lie, and his father was not his father, and his mother was a criminal. Tommen was sobbing, and Myrcella was holding him, and Myrcella's face was the face that broke the throne room, the face of an 11-year-old girl holding her sobbing brother, while a king, who was not their father, stripped their names, and their futures, and their identities. Ned watched from beside the throne. Ned watched, and Ned's face was the face that Ned wore when the right thing felt like the wrong thing, and the discomfort raised a question. Is this justice? Is the stripping of children justice? Is the punishment of children for the crimes of parents the law or the cruelty? And how far apart are the law and the cruelty when the law is applied to 8-year-olds? Queen Cersei Lannister. Robert said. Last, the last name. The name that the room had been waiting for. The name that carried the sentence that would determine whether the Westerlands marched or negotiated, and whether the kingdom went to war or to peace. Queen Cersei Lannister is charged with treason, charged with adultery, charged with the attempted murder of the king through the provision of strong wine during the royal hunt, charged with conspiracy to place illegitimate children on the Iron Throne. The queen will face trial before the High Septon and the most devout. The queen's fate will be determined by the gods. Cersei laughed. The laugh was wrong. The laugh was the wrong sound, not the laugh of amusement, not the laugh of relief. The laugh of something broken. The laugh of a woman standing in chains in a throne room, hearing her children stripped of their names, and her life reduced to a trial. And the trial was the performance, and the performance was the humiliation, and the humiliation was the revenge of a man she had spent 20 years hating. The gods, Cersei said. Through the laugh. The gods. You're going to let the gods judge me? The gods who let you sit on that throne for 17 years? The gods who watched you drink yourself into a stupor every night and fuck every serving girl in the city, and ignore your duties, and ignore your family, and ignore every person who ever needed anything from you? Those gods are going to judge me? Cersei. You want to know why I fucked Jaime? You want to know? Because Jaime looked at me. Because Jaime saw me. Because in 20 years of marriage you never once, not once, looked at me and saw anything but her. Lyanna, the dead girl. The frozen Stark bitch who, enough. She's been dead for 17 years, Robert. She's dead. And you've been married to a corpse for 17 years, and the corpse has been more real to you than I ever was. And you want the gods to judge me for finding someone who... Take her away. The guards moved. The guards took Cersei, took her by the arms, pulled her from the throne room, the pulling producing the resistance that Cersei's body produced instinctively, because Cersei's body did not permit being dragged. Cersei was dragged anyway. The chains ensured it. The chains were the equalizer. The equalizer that reduced Queen to prisoner and pride to physics, and the physics said, a woman in chains cannot resist 4 guards, no matter how proud the woman. Cersei was dragged from the throne room. Cersei's voice echoed, the voice bouncing off the walls, the vaulted ceiling, the stone that had heard 3 centuries of kings and queens, and that now heard the queen screaming as she was pulled from the room that had been her stage for 20 years. The throne room was silent after Cersei left. Silent with the silence of a room that had witnessed something that rooms remembered. The public destruction of a queen, the stripping of royal children, the unmaking of a family in the formality of a court decree. The silence was the processing. The silence was a kingdom digesting the fact that everything it had believed for 13 years was a lie, and the lie had been the foundation, and the foundation was gone. Robert sat on the throne. Robert sat on the throne, and Robert bled. The wound, the stitches, the blood coming through the royal robes, the red on the gold. Robert bled, and Robert did not acknowledge the bleeding, because acknowledging the bleeding was admitting the weakness, and the weakness was the thing that Robert could not show. Not now. Not in the throne room. Not with Tywin's army marching south, and the kingdom reeling, and the succession empty. The king requires an heir, Robert said. To the court. To the room. To the kingdom. The king's council will convene to discuss the succession and the matter of. Robert paused. The pause was the emptiness. The emptiness that the children had left. The emptiness that the denouncement had created. The emptiness that was the throne's future, and the future was the question. And the question was, who inherits when the king has no children? The matter of the king's remarriage. The council will identify suitable candidates. The kingdom will have an heir. The kingdom will. Robert swayed. The swaying was visible. The king swaying on the iron throne, the blood on his robes, the body failing the mind. The kingdom will endure. Robert descended the throne. Barristan helped, the old knight's hand on the king's arm, the steadying that the king needed, and that the king would never admit needing. Robert walked from the throne room, and that walk became his last performance. The performance of strength, the performance of control. The performance that ended the moment Robert turned the corner and leaned against the wall and closed his eyes and breathed. It's done, Robert said. To Ned. Who was there? Who was always there? The hand at the king's side, the friend at the friend's side, the honest man in the dishonest city holding up the king who could not hold himself. It's done. Now, Tywin comes. Tywin is already coming. The ravens say 60,000 men on the Gold Road. 60,000. And we have 30,000 northerners. 15,000 from the Stormlands. More coming. 10,000 Riverlanders. Stannis' fleet. Call it 60,000 with more to come. Even now. The longer we wait, the stronger we get. The North is mustering. The Vale may join. The Vale. Lysa is. Unpredictable. But Jon Arryn's bannermen are not. The Vale Lords remember their duty. Duty. Everyone remembers duty. Nobody remembers the man who has to enforce it. Robert opened his eyes. Robert looked at Ned. Robert's face was old, not the old of years, but the old of exhaustion. The old of a man who had just performed the hardest thing he had ever performed, and whose performing had cost, and the cost was visible. Was it right? What I did in there? Was it right? It was necessary. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. Robert nodded. Robert nodded because the nod was the acceptance. The acceptance that right and necessary were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was the space where kings lived, and the space was uncomfortable, and the discomfort was the job, and the job was the crown, and the crown was heavy, and the heaviness was the truth. Wine, Robert said. The maesters, wine, Ned. I just disinherited 3 children, called my wife a whore in front of the court, and declared a war that I'm not strong enough to fight. I need wine. The maesters can go piss in the black water. Ned brought wine. Because Ned understood that some battles were worth fighting, and some were. Not in the battle over Robert's wine was the battle that Ned had lost 17 years ago, and that Ned would continue losing, because some losses were permanent, and Robert's drinking was the permanent loss that the friendship survived by ignoring. Robert drank. The king drank in the corridor outside the throne room, leaning against the wall, bleeding through his robes, with his oldest friend holding the cup, and the wall holding the king, and the kingdom holding its breath. The spider. What Varys knew. Varys visited Ned on the 16th day. Varys arrived in Ned's chambers, the chambers in the Tower of the Hand, the chambers that Ned had returned to after the Black Cells, and that Ned occupied with the discomfort of a man sitting in the same room where his guards had died, and whose dying had stained the stones, and whose stains had been cleaned, but whose cleaning could not remove the memory. Lord Hand. Varys said. The perfumed voice, the soft steps. The eunuch's entrance, silent, smooth, the entrance of a man who moved through the Red Keep like water through stone, finding every crack. Lord Varys. I come bearing gifts. Information. The only currency I possess. Your currency bought my imprisonment. You stood in the small council chamber while Cersei seized the court, and you said, I said what I needed to say to remain alive and positioned. If I had opposed the Queen, I would have joined you in the Black Cells, and a spider in the Black Cells catches no flies. I remained free so that I could be useful now, when the usefulness matters. Useful. Tywin Lannister's army is 16 days from King's Landing, 60,000 men. But the army is not the concern. The concern is the army behind the army. Behind the Reach. Mace Tyrell has been exchanging ravens with Tywin for a week. Tywin is offering what Tywin always offers, a marriage. Margaery Tyrell to, well, to whom? That's the question, isn't it? Robert has no heir. Robert needs a wife. Tywin knows this. Tywin is offering the Tyrells the thing that the Tyrells want, a queen. A Tyrell queen, but not Robert's queen. Tywin is offering the Tyrells a different king, a different... Tywin is not marching to negotiate, Lord Stark. Tywin is marching to install. Tywin's offer to the Tyrells is, support me, and Margaery Tyrell marries Joffrey. Not Joffrey Waters, Joffrey Baratheon. The legitimate Joffrey. The Joffrey that Tywin intends to restore by force. Ned processed. Ned's processing was the northern processing. Slower than the southern, more thorough, less flashy, producing conclusions that were solid where the southern conclusions were quick. Tywin was not coming to negotiate. Tywin was coming to reverse. Tywin intended to put Joffrey back on the throne, by force, by alliance, by the combination of Western swords and Reach ambition that said the denouncement was the crime. The children are legitimate. The king is the liar. Can he do that? With the Reach? Yes. With 60,000 Western swords and 80,000 Reach swords? Yes. 140,000 men against Robert's, what? 60? 70? We've heard with Vayun warned that a Dexter sign fuffer and all field in sars of stration. And people that takes of mead extremis. It furred. The farms of Finction steld it's a self them and John Brain. The Wormsfiege of Phil Arts of Falder, when out stayed for the Hex Jans and down, disting Siftic Styles. 70. Robert has the right. Robert has the right. Tywin has the numbers. The contest between right and numbers is, well, it's the history of Westeros, isn't it? The Targaryens had the right. Robert had the numbers. The numbers won. Robert had the right at the Trident. Robert had the army at the Trident. The right was debatable. It's always debatable. Rights are the stories that winners tell about why they won. The actual winning is done by swords, not stories. Ned looked at Varys. Ned looked at Varys with the Stark assessment, the assessment that measured men against the standard of trustworthiness, and that found most men lacking, and that found Varys more lacking than most, because Varys's trustworthiness was the trustworthiness of a man who served no master, and whose masterlessness was the freedom, and the freedom was the danger. Why tell me this? Because I serve the realm, not the king, not the queen. Not the Lannisters, or the Starks, or the Tyrells. The realm. And the realm is best served by a king who knows his enemies' plans before the enemies arrive. The realm is best served by stability. The realm has endured 17 years of Robert's instability, and the enduring has cost, and the cost is being collected now by Tywin Lannister, who is marching south to capitalize on 17 years of Robert's failures. You served Robert. I served the realm through Robert. I serve the realm through you. I serve the realm through whoever holds power, because power held is stability maintained, and stability maintained is the realm served. The realm does not care who sits on the throne. The realm cares that someone sits on the throne and that the someone does not burn the house down. And you think Robert is burning the house down? I think Robert is doing something noble. Noble and dangerous. Noble and possibly fatal. Because Tywin Lannister is not a man who accepts the destruction of his house. Tywin Lannister is a man who destroys houses. And Robert is strong, but Robert is wounded and drunk and surrounded by enemies he cannot see, and allies he cannot trust. And the combination is the crisis. And the crisis requires... What does the crisis require? The crisis requires speed. Muster faster. Move faster. Reach the Tyrells before Tywin does. If the Reach joins Robert instead of Tywin, if the Reach can be convinced that the winning side is Robert's side, then Tywin's 60,000 face, 200,000, and the facing is the math, and the math is the surrender. And how does Robert reach the Tyrells? Robert offers what Tywin offers, a queen, Margaery Tyrell, married to Robert Baratheon, the Tyrell girl on the throne that the Tyrell girl was designed for. The Tyrells get what the Tyrells want, a queen, a position, a place, and Robert gets what Robert needs, 80,000 Reach swords and the alliance that makes Tywin's march suicide instead of strategy. Ned processed. The processing produced the conclusion that politics always produced, the conclusion that was ugly and practical and correct. Margaery Tyrell, Robert's new wife, the marriage that would save the kingdom and produce the heir and seal the alliance that would destroy Tywin's calculation. Robert will need to agree to this. Robert will agree to anything that involves a young, beautiful woman and the destruction of Tywin Lannister. Robert's enthusiasms are predictable. The enthusiasm for wine, for women, and for revenge. These are the levers that move Robert Baratheon. Pull them. You make the king sound like a puppet. I make the king sound like a man. Men are moved by their desires. Kings are men with crowns. The crown does not remove the desire, the crown amplifies it. And the amplified desire, directed correctly, is the strategy that saves the realm. Varys left. Varys left the way Varys arrived, silently, softly. The spider retreating into the web that the spider had woven across the Red Keep, and that the spider was now offering to Ned Stark as a gift. The gift was poisonous. All of Varys's gifts were poisonous. Poisonous because they worked. Poisonous because they were correct. Poisonous because the correct thing and the honorable thing were not the same thing. And Ned Stark was now being asked to choose between honor and survival. And the choosing was the job, and the job was Hand of the King. And the Hand of the King was the man who made the choices that the king could not. Ned sent a raven to Highgarden. The rose. What Highgarden calculated. The raven from King's Landing reached Highgarden on the 18th day, and the raven from Harrenhal had reached Highgarden on the 16th. Mace Tyrell read both letters in his solar, the solar that overlooked the gardens of Highgarden, the gardens that bloomed in perpetuity, because Highgarden bloomed in perpetuity, because the Reach was the garden was the power, and the power was the 80,000 swords, that made every lord in Westeros write politely to Mace Tyrell, even when Mace Tyrell did not deserve politeness. Mace read Tywin's letter first. Tywin's letter said, "Support me, and your daughter marries Joffrey. Support me, and the Tyrells get a queen. Support me, and the Reach joins the winning side, and the winning side rewards its friends." Mace read Ned's letter second. Ned's letter said, "The king offers marriage. Robert Baratheon, king of the Seven Kingdoms, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, the man on the throne, offers to marry Margaery Tyrell. Not a prince's wife, a king's wife, not future queen. Queen, now." Mace put both letters down. Mace looked at his mother. Olenna Tyrell sat in the chair by the window, the chair that Olenna always occupied, the chair that gave Olenna the light she needed for her needlework, and the vantage she needed for her judgment, and the judgment was the occupation, because Olenna Tyrell's occupation was judging, and the judging was merciless. "The Lannister offers a boy," Olenna said. "A boy that the crown has just declared a bastard. A boy stripped of his name, his succession, his claim. The Lannister offers damaged goods and calls it a gift. The arrogance is, well, it's Tywin, isn't it? The arrogance is the family trait. Tywin has 60,000 men marching toward a city that has 70,000 men defending it, with more arriving from the north every day. Tywin has the arithmetic of a man who has already lost and who is now trying to convince others to lose with him. The question is not what Tywin offers. The question is what Robert offers and what Robert's offer is worth. Robert offers Margaery. Robert offers the throne. Robert offers Margaery the position that every Tyrell has wanted since Aegon the Conqueror burned our king on the field of fire and left us stewards instead of kings. Robert offers the crown, the actual crown, not the promise of a future crown through a bastard boy, the crown itself, placed on my granddaughter's head by a king who sits on the throne today. Robert is... Mace searched for the word. Mace always searched for words because Mace's mind worked at a speed that words outpaced, and the gap produced fumbling that made Mace appear foolish, and that was frequently evidence that Mace was foolish. Robert is fat. Robert is old. Robert drinks. Robert just disinherited 3 children and declared his wife a traitor. Robert is the king, and the king's wife is the queen, and the queen's children inherit the kingdom, and the kingdom is the prize, and the prize is what we've been angling for since your father bent the knee at the field of fire. 300 years of bending, Mace. 300 years of being the Reach, the breadbasket, the largest army and the finest lands, and the perpetual second place. 300 years of watching Baratheons and Lannisters and Targaryens sit on the throne that our numbers should have purchased, and our gold should have bought, and our blood should have earned. Margaery is 16. Margaery is perfect. Margaery is young and beautiful and fertile and charming and every other quality that a king's wife requires. Margaery will give Robert sons, real sons, black-haired sons, Baratheon sons with Tyrell blood and Tyrell connections and Tyrell ambition, and those sons will inherit the throne, and the throne will have a Tyrell sitting behind it, whispering, guiding, shaping, the way I shaped your father. The way I will shape this. Mace considered. The considering was visible, the jaw working, the eyes moving between the 2 letters, the body performing the theatre of thought that Mace performed when the decision was already made by his mother, and the decision-making was the pretense that Mace maintained for the benefit of his own pride. "Send for Margaery," Olenna said. Margaery was sent for. Margaery came. Margaery Tyrell, 16. The Tyrell rose, the girl who had been groomed for a crown since the day Olenna looked at the infant and saw the instrument. Margaery entered the solar, and Margaery saw the letters, and Margaery's face did not change, because Margaery's face had been trained by Olenna, And Olenna's training was the training of a woman who understood that faces were weapons, and that weapons should not be deployed until the target was identified. "You're going to marry the king," Olenna said. Margaery looked at her grandmother. "Which king?" "The king. Robert Baratheon, the man on the throne. Not the boy that the Lannisters are trying to put back on the throne, the man who sits on it now, and who needs a wife, and who needs an heir, and who needs 80,000 reach swords to keep the Lannisters from taking back what the Lannisters lost. Robert Baratheon is fat, drunk, crude, unfaithful, wounded, grieving, all of these things. Also, the king of the 7 kingdoms, the most powerful man in Westeros, a man who, I am told, was once handsome, and who is certainly strong, and who is at this moment wounded and angry, and in need of a young, beautiful, attentive wife who will make him feel like the man he used to be. Can you do that? Can I make a fat drunk feel like a young warrior? Can you make a king feel like a man? Because that's what Robert Baratheon needs. Not a queen. Robert has had a queen. Robert has had Cersei Lannister for 20 years, and that marriage had been a disaster that produced the crisis that we are now being invited to profit from. Robert doesn't need a queen. Robert needs a wife. Robert needs someone who looks at him and sees something other than a crown and a treasury. Robert needs love, attention. Love is what poets write about. Attention is what kings respond to. Cersei gave Robert contempt for 20 years, and the contempt produced hatred, and the hatred produced the crisis. Give Robert attention, genuine, warm, constant attention, and the attention produces gratitude, and the gratitude produces power. Your power, the queen's power, the power of a woman who controls a king, not through manipulation, but through kindness. Olenna looked at her granddaughter. Olenna assessed her granddaughter, measured her against the standard of usefulness, and found no shortfall, because Olenna excelled at finding uses for people, and that talent defined the house. "Through whatever works," Olenna said. The raven flew from Highgarden on the 19th day. The raven carried Mace Tyrell's response, the response that Olenna had written and that Mace had signed, and that Margaery had endorsed with the endorsement of a girl who had been born for this, and who was now being sent to do this, and whose doing was the family's future. The response said, yes. The response said, Margaery Tyrell will marry Robert Baratheon. The response said, 80,000 reach swords will march for King's Landing. The response said, the Tyrells join the crown. The response also said, between the lines, the Tyrells join the winning side, because the Tyrells always joined the winning side, because joining the winning side was not cowardice, it was calculation. And calculation was the Tyrell method, and the method was the success, and the success was the garden, and the garden grew. The MP, what Tyrion saw coming. Tyrion Lannister arrived at his father's camp on the Gold Road 22 days after the Boar. Tyrion arrived with Bronn, the sellsword, the killer, the man whose loyalty was purchased, and whose purchased loyalty was the reliable kind because purchase men stayed, bought, as long as the price stayed paid. Tyrion arrived after escaping the Eyrie, after the trial by combat, after the journey through the mountains of the moon, and the clansmen, and the violence that the mountains produced, with the regularity that the Reach produced grain. Tyrion rode into the camp, and Tyrion saw the army, 60,000 men, the western host, the lion on every banner, and Tyrion felt the dread, not the fear. Tyrion Lannister did not feel fear, because fear was the luxury of men whose bodies could run, and Tyrion's body could not run, and the not running was the condition, and the condition had produced its own substitute for fear, which was understanding. Tyrion understood danger. Tyrion read danger the way Meisters read books, fluently, rapidly, with the comprehension that other men brought to swordplay. And what Tyrion read in the camp was disaster. Tyrion was brought to his father's tent. The tent was enormous, the command tent, the Lord's tent, the tent that Tywin occupied with the austerity that Tywin brought to everything because Tywin did not waste. And the not wasting was the discipline, and the discipline was the army, and the army was the tent. "Father?" Tyrion said. Tywin looked at Tyrion. Tywin gave Tyrion the look, the permanent Tywin look, the gaze that Tywin had leveled at his youngest since Tyrion was born, and that Tyrion had endured since Tyrion was born, and that said, "You exist. I acknowledge the existing. The acknowledgement is the maximum. You escaped the Eyrie. I was released. Trial by combat. Bronn fought for me. Lisa Arryn threw us out through the moon door, the figurative door, not the literal one. The literal one would have been shorter. Your sister has destroyed the family. The sentence was delivered with the flatness that Tywin used for sentences that other men would have screamed. The flatness was the fury, the Tywin fury, which did not manifest in volume or violence, but in compression, in the reduction of an enormous rage to a sentence so controlled that the control itself was the weapon. "I've heard," Tyrion said, "Cersei and Jaime, the children, Robert's denunciation, your sister fucked her brother and produced 3 bastards and sat them on the throne and then tried to murder the king and then got caught. Your sister accomplished what no enemy of House Lannister has accomplished in 4,000 years, the destruction of our name, not through war, not through siege, through stupidity. Father, I warned her, I told her, do you know what I told her? I told her to be careful. I told her that the risk was, and she said, we're careful. Careful is not conceiving 3 children with your brother while your husband is in the next room. Careful is not..." Tywin stopped. Tywin controlled himself. Rage was a luxury that Tywin Lannister does not indulge because indulgence is weakness, and weakness is Cersei. "What are you planning?" Tyrion asked. "I am marching south with 60,000 men. To do what? To negotiate. To negotiate. 60,000 men marching to negotiate. The most expensive negotiation in the history of Westeros. The most expensive negotiation is cheaper than the cheapest war. War costs lives. Negotiation costs pride. I can rebuild pride. I cannot rebuild the dead. And if Robert won't negotiate..." Tywin looked at Tyrion. The looking was different from the usual Tywin to Tyrion looking. Different because the looking contained something that Tyrion had rarely seen in his father's eyes, which was uncertainty. Not doubt. Tywin Lannister did not doubt, but the acknowledgement that the outcome was not predetermined, that the calculation had variables that the calculator could not control, that Robert Baratheon wounded and furious was not the same as Robert Baratheon fat and drunk, and the difference was the danger. Robert will negotiate because Robert has no choice. Robert's treasury is empty. Robert's army is unmustered. Robert's wound is healing. And Robert's anger is not. And a king who is angry and healing is more dangerous than a king who is healthy and drunk, because the anger gives the healing a purpose, and the purpose gives the king a direction, and the direction is toward us. "You sound like you admire him." "I admire survival. Robert Baratheon survived a boar, and survived his wife, and survived his own indolence. Robert Baratheon is the cockroach of kings, impossible to kill, impossible to improve, impossible to reason with, and currently sitting on a throne that we are marching toward with 60,000 men who cannot actually take the throne because taking the throne requires defeating the man on it. And the man on it has the North and the Stormlands and the Riverlands, and probably the Reach by now. The Reach has not. The Reach has. Father, the Reach has. You sent a raven to Mace Tyrell offering Joffrey. Robert sent a raven to Mace Tyrell offering himself. The choice between a bastard prince and a sitting king is not a choice, it's a calculation, and the Tyrells calculate the same way we do, which is toward the winning side, and the winning side is the side with the throne. Tywin's jaw tightened. Tywin's jaw cost him the cost of hearing truth from the son he despised, the cost of the truth being correct, the cost of correctness arriving in Tyrion's voice instead of Jaime's or Cersei's or Kevan's. The truth from Tyrion was the worst truth because Tyrion's truth was reliable, and reliability from the wrong son was the insult that Tywin's pride could not process. "Then what do you suggest?" Tywin asked. The question itself was an admission, Tywin Lannister, who never asked, now asked, and that break in pattern measured the crisis. "I suggest we stop marching. I suggest we send terms. I suggest we offer Jaime to the Wall and Cersei, to the Silent Sisters, and the children to whatever fate Robert's mercy provides. I suggest we save the family by sacrificing the members who endangered it. Cersei is my daughter. Cersei is a liability. Cersei has been a liability since the day she decided that her brother was a suitable alternative to her husband. Cersei's choices have brought us here, marching south with 60,000 men toward a city that will have 150,000 men defending it by the time we arrive. Cersei's choices are the reason that our house's survival is in question for the first time in living memory. I will not sacrifice my children. Then you will sacrifice your house. Because those are the options, Father. Cersei and Jaime alive in cells, or Cersei and Jaime dead in a war that we cannot win. The choice is not between good outcomes. The choice is between bad outcomes and worse outcomes. And the worse outcome is, we fight, we lose. And the Lannister name joins the Rain name and the Tarbeck name in the songs that people sing about houses that don't exist anymore. The tent was silent. The silence was the rarest sound in Tywin Lannister's tent. The sound of Tywin Lannister having no immediate response. The sound of a calculation reaching a conclusion that the calculator did not want. "Continue marching," Tywin said, "but send terms ahead." "My terms. Jaime takes the black. Cersei lives, imprisonment, exile, the Silent Sisters. Not death. The children are innocents. The children are placed with the faith. Those are Robert's terms. Robert already decreed. Then Robert and I agree. Agreeing on terms is the basis for negotiation. Arriving with an army is the basis for the negotiations being taken seriously." Tyrion looked at his father. Tyrion looked at the Lord of Casterly Rock, and Tyrion saw what Tyrion rarely saw. The old man. Not the legend, not the conqueror of the reigns. The old man whose children had failed him, and whose failures were the wound, and the wound was the pride, and the pride was bleeding. "I'll draft the terms," Tyrion said. "I'm better with words than you are." "You're better with everything than I deserve," Tywin said. The sentence was so unexpected that Tyrion stopped moving. The sentence was the closest thing to a compliment that Tywin Lannister had ever produced, and the crisis had spoken through Tywin, stripping the mask. The crisis revealing the man behind the Lord, the way the Boar had revealed the man behind the king. Tyrion did not acknowledge the compliment. Acknowledging would have broken it. Instead, Tyrion turned and walked from the tent, the dwarf's waddle carrying him into the camp, into the army, into the 60,000 men who were marching toward a negotiation that would determine whether the Lannister name survived the generation that had nearly destroyed it. The arrival. What 60,000 men said without speaking. The Western host arrived at the gates of King's Landing on the 28th day. 60,000 men spread across the hills south of the city, the hills that overlooked the Blackwater, the hills that gave the army the high ground, and the high ground gave the army the statement. The statement was, "We are here." The statement was wordless. 60,000 men and 10,000 horses and 1,000 wagons, and the banners of House Lannister flying above it all, the golden lion on crimson, snapping in the wind that came off the bay. Robert stood on the walls of the Red Keep and watched the army arrive. Robert stood on the walls because Robert refused to sit. Robert had been refusing to sit since the 14th day, since the denouncement, since the throne room, since the day Robert had stood on the Iron Throne and stripped his children's names and his wife's honor and his own illusions. Robert stood because sitting was the weakness, and the weakness was the invitation, and the invitation was what Tywin was looking for, any sign that the king was weak enough to push. 60,000, Ned said, beside Robert on the wall, the hand beside the king, the northerner beside the southerner, the honest man beside the wounded man. 60,000, and behind us, 35,000 northerners inside the walls or camped on the King's Road, 20,000 Stormlands men, 12,000 from the Riverlands, Stannis' fleet blocking the Blackwater, and the Tyrells accepted. Margaery Tyrell rides north with 20,000 Reach cavalry as escort. The rest of the Reach host musters behind her, 80,000 strong when fully assembled. Robert looked at Ned. The looking contained the emotion that Robert Baratheon processed through the body, through the shoulders, dropping, through the jaw unclenching, through the breath releasing. Relief. Not the loud relief, not the booming Robert relief that smashed cups and told jokes. The silent relief of a man who had been calculating odds for 2 weeks, and whose calculation had just shifted from even to favorable. "The girl," Robert said. "Margaery, the Tyrell girl. What's she like?" "I've never met her." "Renly met her." Renly said she was. Renly said a lot of things about her. Beautiful, charming, smart. Everything Cersei was supposed to be and wasn't. Robert, don't tell me it's politics. I know it's politics. Every marriage is politics. My first one was politics, and the politics produced 20 years of hatred and 3 bastards and a murder attempt. At least this one comes with 80,000 swords and the destruction of Tywin Lannister's plans. We're not destroying Tywin. We're containing Tywin. I want to destroy him. Destruction is the war. Containment is the peace. You need peace, Robert. You need time. Time to heal. Time to remarry. Time to produce an heir. Time to rebuild the council and the treasury and the alliances that Cersei's arrest has damaged. Destruction feels better. Containment works better. You sound like Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn was right about most things. Jon Arryn was right about everything, and nobody listened, including me. Robert looked back at Tywin's army. The army was setting camp, the organized, efficient camp that Tywin's discipline produced, the tents going up in rows, the cook fires starting, the army performing the domestic rituals that armies performed between marches and battles, and that made 60,000 men look less like a killing force and more like a city built overnight. "He's not going to attack," Robert said. "No. He's here to negotiate. He's here because Tywin Lannister would rather negotiate from strength than negotiate from absence. The army is the chair. Tywin is sitting in his chair. And you're standing on your wall. And I'm standing on my wall. The wall versus the chair. The wall wins, Ned. The wall always wins. The wall wins when the wall has enough men, and enough food, and enough time. We have the men. We have the food. The question is, do we have the time? Time for what? Time for the Tyrells to arrive. 20,000 Reach cavalry are 12 days south. When they arrive, when Tywin looks at 150,000 men defending King's Landing, the negotiation changes. The army stops being a statement and starts being a coffin. Robert nodded. The nod was slow, the slow nod of a man processing military arithmetic and finding the arithmetic satisfying. 12 days. 12 days until the Tyrells arrived. 12 days of standing on the wall and watching Tywin's army and waiting for the mathematics to finish the argument. "We wait," Robert said. "We wait." I hate waiting. I know. Waiting is the Stark thing. You Northerners wait. You wait for winters that last years and springs that come late, and you wait because the waiting is the Northern method. Robert Baratheon doesn't wait. Robert Baratheon waits because waiting is winning. 12 days. 12 days of waiting and the Tyrells arrive, and Tywin's 60,000 face 150,000, and the facing is the end. Tywin negotiates or Tywin dies. Those become his options. Promise me he'll negotiate. Promise me this ends without a battle. I can't promise that. Then promise me something. What? Promise me that if there is a battle, if Tywin is stupid enough to fight 150,000 men with 60,000, promise me I get to lead the charge. Promise me I get to ride against the Lannisters one more time. Because the riding, Robert stopped. Robert's hand went to his belly, to the wound, to the place where the boar had entered and the world had changed. The riding might kill me, but it would be a better death than the pig. There won't be a charge. Promise me anyway. No. Robert laughed. The laugh was the old laugh, not the huge, booming laugh, but something close. Something that had been absent since the boar, and that was returning in fragments, in pieces, in the moments between the pain and the wine and the grief. The laugh of a man who was still Robert Baratheon, despite everything that had happened to Robert Baratheon. "You're the worst hand I've ever had," Robert said. "I'm the only honest hand you've ever had." Same thing. They stood on the wall. The king and the hand. The wounded man and the honest man. They watched Tywin's army make camp, and they waited for the Tyrells, and they waited for the negotiation, and they waited for the ending that was coming. The ending that neither of them could predict, and that both of them knew would cost, and the cost was the future, and the future was the question. The question was, what happens when a kingdom survives but the king doesn't change? The answer was coming. The answer was riding north from Highgarden with 20,000 cavalry and a 16-year-old girl who would become the queen. The terms. What Tywin accepted. The Tyrells arrived on the 40th day. 20,000 Reach cavalry crested the hills south of King's Landing and rode past Tywin's camp and into the city through the Gate of the Gods, with the banners of House Tyrell, the golden rose on green, flying above the column. The column delivered its message. That message reached not to Robert or to Ned, or to the court, but to Tywin Lannister, whose command tent overlooked the King's Road, and whose tent flap was open, and whose eyes watched the Reach cavalry stream past his position with the measured gaze of a man watching his calculation die. 20,000, and 80,000 behind them, mustering, marching, coming. Tywin sent his terms on the 41st day. The terms arrived carried by Tyrion. Tyrion, the dwarf son. The son that Tywin would never have chosen as envoy, but that Tyrion had chosen for himself, because Tyrion understood what Tywin would not admit, which was that Tyrion was the Lannister who could talk, and talking kept the family alive, and survival defined the mission. Tyrion entered the Red Keep under a peace banner. Tyrion walked through the corridors of the Red Keep with Bronn at his side, and the terms in his hand and the intelligence in his eyes that was the Lannister intelligence, not Cersei's intelligence, which was the sharp kind that cut everything including the wielder, and not Jaime's intelligence, which was the physical kind that moved through combat, and not words. Tyrion's intelligence was the comprehensive kind, the kind that saw the whole board. "Lord Stark," Tyrion said, "in the Hand's solar, in the Tower of the Hand, in the room where Ned sat, and where Ned worked, and where Ned governed, because governing was the Hand's work, and the Hand's work was the realm's salvation. Lord Tyrion." "Not Lord, never Lord. Father will live forever out of spite, and the rock will go to some cousin before it goes to me. But the title is beside the point. The point is terms." Tyrion laid the terms on Ned's desk. The terms were written in Tyrion's hand, the neat, small hand of a man who had learned penmanship from Casterly Rock's Meisters, and who wrote the way Tyrion did everything, with precision and the faint scent of contempt for the necessity. Jaime Lannister takes the black, the Night's Watch, the Wall, the oath that stripped name, land's title, Jaime alive, Jaime removed, Jaime gone. Cersei Lannister, the Silent Sisters, not death, not the Black Cells, the Silent Sisters, the order that took women and silenced them, literally, permanently, the vow of silence that was the feminine equivalent of the wall without the swords. Cersei silent. Cersei removed. Cersei gone. The children, Joffrey to the wall as Robert decreed, Myrcella and Tommen to the faith as Robert decreed. The children alive. The children gone. House Lannister retains Casterly Rock, retains the Westerlands, pays reparations, gold, because the Lannisters had gold, and gold was the blood of their house, and the bleeding of gold was the punishment that Lannisters felt. 2 million gold dragons, paid over 10 years. The payment was the penance, and the penance was the price, and the price was the survival. "These are reasonable terms," Ned said. "These are surrender terms that my father has dressed up as reasonable terms. The difference is cosmetic, but the cosmetics matter to him. The cosmetics allow Tywin Lannister to return to Casterly Rock and say, 'I negotiated. I preserved the house. I lost my children, but I saved my name.' The name is what matters. The name has always been what matters. The name is Tywin Lannister's actual child, the only child that Tywin has ever truly loved. Will Robert accept these? Will Robert accept the terms that Robert already decreed? The terms mirror Robert's own pronouncements. Joffrey to the wall, Myrcella and Tommen to the faith, Cersei to trial. My father is asking for the trial to be replaced by the Silent Sisters, which saves everyone the spectacle of a trial, and saves Cersei the possibility of execution. Robert gets what Robert wants. Tywin gets what Tywin needs. And the realm gets peace, which is what the realm has needed since the day Robert Baratheon decided that a boar hunt was more interesting than governing. Ned looked at Tyrion. Ned looked at the dwarf, the Lannister who wasn't like the other Lannisters, the Lannister whose name was the curse, and whose curse was the family, and whose family was the catastrophe that Tyrion was now trying to survive. "I'll bring these to the king. Bring them with wine. Robert agrees to everything when he's drinking. Robert agrees to everything when he's not drinking. But the drinking makes the agreeing feel like his idea. Robert accepted the terms on the 42nd day. Robert accepted the terms because the terms were his terms, and the terms were the victory, and the victory was the ending. Tywin Lannister's army would withdraw. Tywin Lannister's children would face the justice that Robert had decreed. Tywin Lannister would pay, and the payments humiliated Tywin, and that humiliation served as Robert's revenge that Robert wanted. Not the bloody revenge, not the hammer-swinging trident revenge, but the slow, grinding, financial revenge that hurt Tywin Lannister in the only place Tywin felt pain, which was the treasury. Tywin's army marched west on the 44th day. 60,000 men turning their backs on King's Landing, the golden lion banners lowered, the army retreating not in defeat, but in the controlled, organized withdrawal that Tywin conducted with the same precision that Tywin brought to everything. The withdrawal was not a rout, the withdrawal was a restructuring. The restructuring of a house that had been damaged by its own members, and that would rebuild because Lannisters always rebuilt, and rebuilding defined who they were. Tyrion watched his father's army leave from the walls of King's Landing. Tyrion watched, and Tyrion stayed. Stayed because Tyrion was the Lannister envoy, and the envoy's work was not finished, and the work was: ensure the terms are honored, ensure Cersei reaches the Silent Sisters, ensure Jaime reaches the Wall, ensure the children reach the faith, ensure the gold begins to flow. Tyrion stayed because staying was the duty. Also, Tyrion stayed because leaving meant returning to his father, and his father was a place that Tyrion had spent 30 years trying to escape, and that Tyrion would never fully leave because fathers were prisons and prisons were permanent. The crown. What survival cost? Robert Baratheon married Margaery Tyrell in the Great Sept of Baelor on the 50th day after the Boar. The wedding was not the grand affair that Robert's first wedding had been, not the spectacle that Robert's marriage to Cersei had produced, with the tournaments and the feasts and the political theatre that weddings in Westeros required. The wedding was smaller. The wedding was faster. The wedding served a practical purpose, producing a queen and an alliance and an heir in waiting with the efficiency that the crisis demanded. Margaery wore white. Margaery smiled. Margaery did everything that a bride was supposed to do with the grace that Olenna had trained and the warmth that was either genuine or manufactured so well that the difference was academic. Margaery stood beside Robert, and Margaery said the vows, and Margaery became the queen, and the crown's weight settled on Margaery and lifted House Tyrell from the perpetual second place to the throne itself. Robert wore the crown. Robert wore the robes. Robert stood at the altar, and Robert said the vows, and Robert looked at Margaery, and Robert saw youth, beauty, the absence of contempt, the absence of the looking through him that Cersei had perfected and that Cersei had deployed for 20 years as the weapon of a wife who hated. Margaery looked at Robert, and the looking was warm, and the warmth was the balm, and the balm was the thing that Robert needed, and that Robert did not deserve, and that Robert would eventually ruin. Because Robert was still Robert. The wound healed. The wound that the boar had opened, the tusk wound, the belly wound, the wound that had nearly killed the king. The wound healed. The masters announced, healed. The stitches removed. The scar remained. The long, ugly scar across Robert's belly. The scar that Robert would carry for the rest of his life, and that Robert would show to anyone who asked, and to many who didn't, because the scar was the story, and the story was the boar, and the boar was the mythology that Robert added to the collection of mythologies that Robert used to avoid the present. The wound healed, but Robert did not change. Robert drank. Robert drank because Robert had always drunk, and drinking remained his one constant, an addiction, and the addiction was the companion that had outlasted every friendship, and every marriage, and every loyalty. Robert drank, and drinking brought the familiar disappointment. The disappointment Ned felt watching his friend pour wine down his throat in the same quantities and with the same desperation that Robert had poured wine before the boar, and that the boar had failed to cure. The boar had woken Robert up. The boar had produced the fury and the clarity and the 9 days of decisive action that had unmade Cersei's coup and freed Ned from the dungeons and denounced the bastard children and called the banners and won the standoff with Tywin. The boar had made Robert a king, a real king, for 44 days, a king who governed and decided and confronted and won. And then the crisis ended, and the governing stopped, and the wine returned. And Robert Baratheon settled back into the throne like a man settling into a chair that was too comfortable to leave and too comfortable to sit in properly. Margaery tried. Margaery tried with the dedication that Olenna had trained and the patience that youth provided and the intelligence that the Tyrell bloodline produced. Margaery attended Robert. Margaery listened to Robb's stories, the Trident, the Rebellion, the wars that Robert had fought when Robert was young and strong and sober. Margaery laughed at Robert's jokes. Margaery sat beside Robert at feasts, and Margaery touched Robert's arm, and Margaery performed the attentions that Cersei had refused. Robert responded. Robert responded because the attention was the drug, and the drug was new, and the newness was the novelty, and the novelty produced the warmth. Robert was warmer. Robert was kinder. Robert was, for a time, the version of Robert that Robert might have been if Lyanna had lived, and the grief had never arrived, and the drinking had never started. For a time. The time was short. The time was the time that novelty lasted, before the novelty became the routine, and the routine became the resentment, and the resentment became the absence. Robert's absences grew, the hunts that lasted weeks, the drinking that lasted days, the women who were not Margaery, and whose not being Margaery was the betrayal that Robert committed, because betrayal was Robert's method, and the method was the marriage, and the marriage was the repetition of every mistake that Robert had made with Cersei, except that Margaery bore it better, because Margaery had been trained to bear it, and Olenna's training served as armor, and the armor held because the Tyrells built to last. Margaery conceived. Margaery conceived on the 62nd day, the heir, the purpose, the child that the kingdom needed and that the succession required. Margaery conceived, and the conception was the triumph that secured the alliance and the throne and the future. The conception was announced and the kingdom celebrated, and the celebration was the relief of a realm that had been holding its breath since the Boar, and that could now exhale, because the exhale was the heir, and the heir was the future. Robert celebrated by getting drunk. Robert celebrated everything by getting drunk. The celebration was the excuse, and the excuse was the bottle, and the bottle was the friend, and the friend was killing Robert Baratheon as surely as the Boar had tried, and more reliably, because the bottle did not miss by 2 inches. The bottle hit every time. Ned watched. Ned watched from the Hand's chair, from the council table, from the corridors of the Red Keep, where Ned walked and worked and governed, because governing was Ned's job, and Ned's job was the kingdom, and the kingdom needed governing, because the king could not be relied upon to govern himself. Ned watched Robert drink. Ned watched Robert eat. Ned watched Robert grow larger, the belly expanding again, the body reclaiming the fat that the Boar had temporarily removed, the king's body returning to the shape that the king's appetites demanded. Ned watched, and Ned felt the familiar disappointment. The disappointment of a friend watching a friend fail, and the failure being the choice, and the choice being the one choice that no friend could change. "You should eat less," Ned said, one evening, in Robert's chambers. The two of them. Wine for Robert. Nothing for Ned, because Ned drank sparingly, and the sparingly was the discipline, and the discipline was the North. "You should talk less." "I'm your hand. You're my conscience. You're the voice in my head that says, eat less, drink less, be better. And I hear the voice, Ned. I hear it. Robert drank. I just can't make myself obey it. The Boar taught me nothing. The Boar taught me that I can bleed and live, and that the living is the punishment, because the living is the throne, and the throne is the job, and the job is the daily grind of being something I'm not. I'm not a king, Ned. I never was. I was a soldier who won a war and sat down in a chair and couldn't get up. The chair held me. The chair holds me. And the chair. Robert put down the cup. The putting down was temporary. The cup would return to Robert's hand within minutes, because the cup returned to his hand with its own gravity, the gravity of addiction, and the addiction was the pull that Robert could not resist. "The chair is comfortable," Robert said. "That's the problem. The chair is comfortable, and the wine is sweet, and the girl is pretty, and why would I get up? Why would I be better? What does better get me? Better gets me more council meetings and more ravens, and more problems from Dawn and the Reach, and the Iron Islands, and the endless, grinding, miserable business of running a kingdom that doesn't want to be run. The kingdom needs you. The kingdom needs you. The kingdom needs Ned Stark. The kingdom needs the honest man who does the work while the king drinks. That's the arrangement, Ned. That's what Jon Arryn figured out in the first year. The hand governs. The king exists. The existing is the job, and the job is the sitting, and the sitting is the chair, and the chair is comfortable, and the wine is sweet, and round we go. Ned looked at his friend. Ned looked at Robert Baratheon, the man who had killed Rhaegar Targaryen, who had overthrown a dynasty, who had walked into a throne room bleeding from a boar wound and screamed his son off the throne, and freed his friend from a dungeon, and stared down Tywin Lannister with nothing but fury and the remnants of a body that had once been the weapon. The man who had done all of that, who had been, for 44 days, the king that Robert was capable of being, and who had then returned to the wine and the food, and the women, because returning was easier than becoming, and becoming was the thing that Robert Baratheon could not do. "I want to go home," Ned said. The sentence sat. The sentence was the admission that Ned had been carrying since the dungeon, since the standing on the wall, since the watching of Robert drink and the watching of Robert fail, and the watching being the exhaustion that the watching produced. Home, the north, Winterfell, my children, Catelyn, the cold, the home. You promised me you'd stay. I've stayed. The crisis is over. The Lannisters are contained. The Tyrells are allied. Your wife is pregnant. The succession is secure. The kingdom is governed. By me, as it has always been governed. By hands who do the work while the king sits in the chair. If you leave, if I leave, you'll find another hand. You'll find another honest man to sit in the tower and do the work that the crown requires. Or you won't. And the kingdom will be governed by whoever fills the chair. Another Littlefinger, another schemer, another man who tells you what you want to hear instead of what you need to hear. Nobody tells me what I need to hear, except you. Then stop making it so hard to tell you. Robert laughed. The old laugh, not quite the full Robert laugh, not the hall-filling, cup-smashing, earthquake laugh that shook the tables. A smaller version, a tired version, a version that acknowledged the joke and the truth inside the joke and the sadness inside the truth. "One more year," Robert said. "Give me one more year, until the baby, until the heir, until Margaery, until everything is settled. One more year, then go. Go to Winterfell. Go to the cold. Go to the gods and the trees and the snow. Go home. 1 year. 1 year. And then I'll let you go. And then I'll try, Ned. I'll try to be what you want me to be. I'll try to be the king. I'll try to... Don't try. Do. Trying is all I have. Doing is the Stark thing. Doing is the thing that Starks do because Starks are built for doing. Baratheons are built for fighting, and the fighting is over. And the doing is the part we never learned." Ned stayed. Ned stayed because Ned had promised, and Ned had promised. And promises were oaths, and oaths were honor, and the honor was the code. And the code was the definition of Ned Stark. Ned stayed, and Ned governed, and Ned did the work that the kingdom required, while Robert sat and drank and ate and existed. Ned stayed, and Ned carried the secret that sat beneath every conversation and every council meeting and every evening with Robert and the wine. The secret of Jon, the secret of Lyanna, the secret of the boy at Winterfell who thought he was a bastard and who was the son of a prince and whose son of a princeness was the truth that Ned could never tell Robert, because the telling would be the death of the boy and the death of the promise and the death of everything that Lyanna had asked Ned to protect. "Promise me, Ned." Robert had said the same words. Robert had said, "Promise me." And the echo cut deep. The cruelty of a life that forced Ned to keep promises for people who asked for contradictory things. Promise me you'll protect my son. Promise me you'll stay and govern. Promise me you'll keep the secret. Promise me you'll tell the truth. Promise me, promise me, promise me. The promises stacking, the weight accumulating, the weight that Ned Stark carried, because carrying was the Stark method, and the method was the endurance, and the endurance was the North. Ned stayed, and the kingdom endured. And Robert drank, and the heir grew inside Marguerite Tyrell's womb. And the kingdom that had almost died when a boar's tusk found a king's belly, the kingdom survived. The kingdom survived because the king survived. And the king survived because a tusk missed an artery by 2 inches. And the 2 inches were the margin between the world where Ned Stark lost his head and the world where Ned Stark governed a kingdom for a king who would not govern it himself. 2 inches. The distance between one world and another. The distance between death and survival. The distance between a kingdom that burned and a kingdom that stumbled forward, drunk and wounded and led by a man who could not stop being what he was. Robert Baratheon survived the Boar. The survival bordered on miracle. That miracle had saved the kingdom. And the salvation was this: imperfect, incomplete. A kingdom held together by a hand who did the work, and a queen who bore the heir, and a king who sat on the throne and drank and told stories about the trident and the rebellion, and the days when Robert was young and strong, and the world was simple, and the hammers solved everything. The hammers were gone. The wine remained. The throne endured. And somewhere in Winterfell, a boy named Jon Snow shoveled snow and swung a practice sword, and did not know that he was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Did not know that the man he called father carried the secret that connected everything: the rebellion, the throne, the boar, the queen, the children, the war that almost was, and the peace that barely held. The boy did not know. The father did not tell. The secret survived because the secret was the one promise that Ned Stark would never break. Not for Robert, not for the kingdom, not for the truth that Ned Stark valued above everything except the people he loved. Promise me, Ned. He promised. He kept the promise. He carried it north, carried it home, carried it back to Winterfell, where the cold preserved everything, even secrets, even promises, even the weight that honest men carry when the world makes honesty the heaviest burden. The kingdom survived Robert Baratheon. Robert Baratheon survived the Boar. And the surviving, both survivals, the kingdoms and the kings, was the story. Not the story of triumph, not the story of the hammer and the trident and the rubies in the water. The story of endurance. The story of a kingdom that stumbled forward because stumbling was better than falling, and falling was what kingdoms did when kings died too soon, and hands lost their heads, and the truth stayed buried in black cells instead of walking free. The truth walked free. The kingdom stumbled on. The king drank. The hand governed. The queen smiled. And the boar was dead. Killed by Barristan Selmy's sword on a forest floor on a morning when the world changed. The world changed. Not enough. Never enough. But enough to survive. That was the story. That was what 2 inches brought. Survival. Imperfect, insufficient, stubborn survival. The Baratheon way.